In the grand halls of medieval castles where torches flickered against stone walls and kings ruled with iron fists, there was one figure who could speak freely, mock nobility, and live to see another day. He wore bells on his cap, mismatched colors, and an ever-present grin. To many today, he's nothing more than a fool, a jester, a comic sidekick in tights and makeup. But who was the medieval jester, really? Was he just a clown for the court's amusement, or was there more beneath the motley? The jester is one of history's most misunderstood figures. We picture him through the lens of modern pop culture, a bumbling fool whose only job was to slip on banana peels and make the king chuckle. But the truth? The truth is much deeper, more nuanced, and, frankly, more fascinating than most realize. The medieval jester occupied a strange space, at once low in class yet dangerously close to power. In some courts, he was merely entertainment. In others, he was a confidant, a spy, even an advisor. The very idea of a person who could insult nobility and live was practically heretical in a world governed by strict hierarchies. Yet the jester danced through this social minefield daily. He could expose hypocrisy through satire, mock injustice with humor, and draw laughter while holding a mirror to corruption. In an era where words could kill, the jester's tongue was both weapon and shield. So what did a day in the life of such a man actually look like? From the moment he opened his eyes to the final echo of laughter in the night, what roles did he play? How did he live among kings yet remain an outsider? That's exactly what we're going to explore. This isn't just about the jokes. It's about power, performance, danger, and survival in one of the most brutal yet fascinating periods in history. Stick with me, and by the end, you'll see the jester in a whole new light. If you're into history that goes beyond dates and battles, stories that bring the past to life, consider subscribing. I guarantee this ride through medieval hilarity and horror is one you don't want to miss. Being a jester wasn't just a job, it was a performance of identity. Medieval society was rigid. You were born into your role whether you liked it or not. Peasants stayed peasants. Nobles stayed noble. And yet the jester somehow floated above this structure like a wild card. Technically, most jesters were of low birth and many were even physically disabled, mentally ill, or socially ostracized before entering court life. But once inside the court, everything changed. They became essential. The medieval court was not all pomp and glory, it was also boredom, tension, and scheming. Enter the jester. He served a necessary role, breaking the tension, making people laugh, and offering a brief escape from the burdens of politics and war. But more than that, the jester could say what others could not. Through humor, mimicry, songs, and outrageous honesty, he could expose truths that no noble would dare utter. He was the only one who could roast a baron to his face and get applause instead of a sword. This made jesters both loved and feared. Their social status was paradoxical. They lived at the mercy of their patron, often the king, but wielded influence that far exceeded their station. Some jesters even acted as informal advisors. Their unique position as entertainers gave them access to the royal ear in private, a place where no courtier or noble could easily reach. And in a world where information was power, jesters were valuable. But let's be clear, not every jester had this level of access. There were tiers. The king's personal jester held a higher position than a household fool of a lesser noble. Traveling jesters, or mountebanks, lived even lower, performing in marketplaces for coins and bread. Still, even the lowest jester had a kind of liberty that most commoners could only dream of, the liberty of speech. That alone was revolutionary in the feudal world. Their position also came with risks. A poorly timed joke could end in exile, imprisonment, or worse. The court was a delicate balance of power, and the jester walked that tightrope every day. But the best jesters, the truly legendary ones, could turn danger into opportunity. They mocked tyranny with such wit that it seemed harmless until the message sank in. So while many saw jesters as fools, they were often some of the smartest men in the room. And now that we've set the stage, let's start following our jester from dawn to dusk. A full day in the life of one of the most unique figures in medieval society. Dawn breaks not with grandeur, but with the slow groan of castle life coming to motion. Before the noblemen stir from their feather-stuffed mattresses and before the kitchen boys start clattering pots, the jester is already awake. He doesn't have the luxury of lingering in bed. His day is measured not by sun or bell, but by the mood of the court. If the king wakes irritable, he might summon the jester immediately. And if the jester's not ready, well, there's always another fool waiting for the job. Contrary to romanticized notions of endless leisure and playful antics, a court jester's morning often began early and under pressure. Unlike nobles, who had attendants to dress them and priests to guide them in prayer, the jester had to rely on himself. His chamber, if one could even call it that, was usually a small, tucked-away corner of the castle, perhaps a room above the stables, a nook near the kitchens, or even a cot behind the servants' quarters. It was rarely luxurious, but often afforded slightly more privacy than the average servant, mostly because jesters were considered strange, unpredictable, and best kept at a slight distance. He rises quickly, often to the sound of footsteps echoing through stone corridors or the low growl of guard dogs beginning their shift. No matter how little sleep he's had, whether he spent the night writing a song, drinking with the guards, or secretly spying on noble whispers, he knows he must appear sharp. The fool who's too tired to be funny becomes a liability. Next comes grooming, or what passes for it in the medieval world. Hygiene was not the shining star of the Middle Ages, but jesters were performers, and performers had to be seen. He might wash his face with cold water from a basin, scrape his teeth with a stick or cloth, and comb his hair into that signature wild disarray that looks accidental but is anything but. He'd sometimes darken his eyebrows with soot or mark his face with chalk or coal to exaggerate expressions. The goal was visibility. His face was his instrument, and like a lute or drum, it needed tuning. Now let's talk about dressing, a task that, for a jester, was part routine, part ritual. His clothing wasn't just garish for fun, it was designed for impact. Bright, clashing colors, often in red, yellow, green, and blue, stitched in patterns that drew attention. His outfit might be made of patchwork from dozens of fabrics, adorned with bells sewn into the cuffs and collar. Some wore caps with floppy ears or horns, each ending in tiny brass bells. The jingle wasn't accidental, it announced his presence. It said, "The fool is here." But this wasn't just for show. The outfit served a deeper purpose. The jester had to stand out, to be unmistakable. His costume gave him protection. It told the court, "I'm allowed to say the unspeakable because I wear this." The clothes were a license, and everyone knew it. Once dressed, the jester might eat a quick meal if he had time, usually a simple one. While nobles feasted on eggs, breads, and imported meats, the jester often shared food with kitchen staff or guards. A crust of bread, a bit of dried meat or cheese, maybe some watered wine if he was lucky. His relationship with the servants and guards was often better than with the nobles. They shared a similar class and similar dangers. And unlike courtiers, the staff appreciated a jester's brutal honesty. But there were also mornings when he skipped food entirely. Why? Because he had to prepare. You see, jesters didn't simply improvise all day. The best ones prepared skits, rhymes, jokes, and songs in advance. He might scribble a new verse mocking a local bishop or practice a parody of yesterday's court drama. He needed fresh material constantly. Repetition was deadly in comedy, and in court it was dangerous. A recycled joke about the queen's wig could get a jester whipped, or worse, silenced for good. Sometimes, he'd rehearse silently in the hallway or under his breath near the fire. Other times, he'd practice with his lute, a hurdy-gurdy, or a tiny drum, whatever instrument he was skilled in. Music was essential to a jester's toolkit. A good song could lift moods. A biting rhyme could deliver scandal in verse form, safe under the shield of just a tune. And finally, before stepping into the day proper, the jester did one last thing. He observed. He lingered near corridors, kitchens, or courtyards to listen. Who was arguing? Who came in drunk? Who arrived late last night with no announcement? Gossip was power, and the jester, more than any courtier, was expected to know. His humor wasn't just silly, it was strategic. The best jokes were those laced with secret knowledge. And in a world where information was currency, jesters were rich in ways that gold couldn't buy. By the time the great hall began to stir and nobles yawned their way into morning court, the jester was already ready, smiling, waiting, listening. His face was painted in amusement, his eyes sharp with calculation. Because for him, every day was a performance, and the audience was always watching. While kings slept under velvet canopies and noble ladies bathed in rosewater on the rare occasions they bathed at all, the jester lived in a world caught between luxury and squalor. His life was bound to the palace, but he didn't belong to it. He was essential, yes, but never equal. This duality was reflected perfectly in his living conditions. Neither a servant's corner nor a noble's chamber, his lodging was often in between, literally and figuratively. In a medieval castle, space was precious and social rank determined its quality. The grand chambers were reserved for the royal family, followed by the higher nobility and their immediate retainers. Then came scribes, stewards, knights, guards, and a long list of attendants. Somewhere in that messy hierarchy was the jester. If he served a king directly, particularly if he was a natural fool, someone considered to be mentally impaired, often seen as touched by God, or a licensed fool, someone who performed by skill and wit, he was usually granted a private room. But don't picture a cozy retreat. More often than not, his quarters were modest, a low-ceilinged space tucked near the kitchens or tucked above a stable, possibly a windowless chamber with little more than a straw-filled mattress, a cracked basin, a candle stub, and maybe a small chest for personal items. Music sheets, costume patches, trinkets from past performances, or tools of his trade like puppets or juggling balls. The walls would be bare stone. Cold in winter, damp in spring, sweltering in summer. If the jester was lucky, truly lucky, he might have a small hearth or at least access to one nearby. Despite the sparse surroundings, the jester's space had a certain liveliness. His quarters may have smelled of old cloth and firewood, but they were vibrant with character. Where most rooms in the castle served rigid purposes, his served creativity. It was a place for thinking, improvising, scribbling rhymes by dim light. In this tiny nook, he rehearsed songs, plotted parodies, and nursed bruises from failed tricks or poorly received jokes. The soundscape of his environment was equally eclectic. Living near the kitchens meant he was awoken by the sounds of clanging pots, shouting cooks, and the rhythmic chopping of meat and vegetables. If he was closer to the stables, it was the stamp of hooves, the snorting of horses, the occasional shout of a groom. But regardless of proximity, the castle buzzed with activity from before sunrise until long after sunset, and the jester was expected to exist comfortably within that noise. And yet, despite the chaos, the jester's relationship with the rest of the castle staff was often unusually friendly. Unlike most performers who came and went, the court jester was a fixture. He saw the same faces day after day, stable boys, scullery maids, aging guards, and errand runners. These weren't nobles who feigned laughter for politics. These were real people who judged humor not by status, but by wit. If a jester could make them laugh during morning chores or late-night meal prep, that was real currency. He'd often exchange favors with the servants, a joke in return for gossip, a dance for a boiled egg, a secret shared for help sewing a torn sleeve. This tight network of lower court relationships was a kind of invisible support system, and in more ways than one, it kept him alive. It gave him access to information, protected him from isolation, and kept him grounded. Because while the jester might entertain kings, his roots were still among the common folk. During the day, the jester moved through the castle freely, which in itself was extraordinary. Few common-born individuals could stroll the halls without permission, but the jester was an exception. He was welcome in the kitchens, the guard rooms, the great hall, even the royal chambers at times. This mobility was not only practical, it was symbolic. His presence was tolerated in all layers of the court, yet he belonged fully to none. He could walk among lords and laugh with the cooks. He was everyone's and no one's. The castle, for all its grandeur, could also be a place of deep tension. Intrigue simmered constantly. Alliances were made and broken over meals. A single rumor could doom a noble's career or a servant's life. In this volatile environment, the jester's comedic license was both a blessing and a burden. He might be called to perform during tense negotiations or distract a restless king. He might be forced to mock a guest, someone whose revenge could be subtle and dangerous. His environment was never truly safe. Despite this, the castle was his theater, his hunting ground for material. Every overheard quarrel, every mishap, every scandal was potential content. He'd turn the lord's drunken fall into a slapstick pantomime. He'd parody a bishop's sermon with such biting wit that it sent the court roaring, and the church fuming. He was constantly absorbing, shaping, editing the world around him into laughter. In many ways, the jester lived in the castle like a ghost in a comedy mask. Always present, always watching, rarely acknowledged when not in performance, and yet vital to the structure. When he wasn't performing, he was observing. When he wasn't laughing, he was listening, because he understood something that few others did. The court was a stage, and every person in it a character. He just had better lines. So while his mattress might have been straw and his walls bare stone, The jester's true environment wasn't his room. It was the castle itself. The great halls and dim corridors, the bustling kitchens and secret staircases. This was his domain. And in it, he didn't just survive. He thrived. When picturing the Middle Ages, hygiene usually isn't the first thing that comes to mind. In fact, it might not come to mind at all. Images of unwashed peasants, lice-ridden hair, and open sewage are burned into the public imagination. But while many of these ideas are exaggerated or misrepresented, it's true that hygiene in the medieval world, particularly for those outside the nobility, was often basic, inconsistent, and governed more by tradition than science. And for a jester, the question of cleanliness and physical appearance wasn't just personal, it was professional. The jester, unlike many others in the castle, couldn't afford to look tired, sickly, or disheveled. He wasn't judged by rank or title, but by perception. He had to be visible, memorable, controlled chaos in human form. He had to radiate a kind of exaggerated presence that pulled the eye. And so, despite the lack of daily hot baths or scented soaps, jesters developed routines to care for themselves, not always out of vanity, but out of necessity. Mornings would often begin with a crude washing routine. No plumbing, of course. Instead, a basin of cold water served as a makeshift sink. The jester would splash his face, wipe his neck and underarms with a rough cloth, and rinse his hands. Tooth care, while primitive by modern standards, wasn't unheard of. Some jesters chewed herbs like mint or fennel to freshen breath, rubbed their teeth with rags dipped in salt or ashes, or even used twigs as makeshift brushes. Oral hygiene mattered. A foul mouth didn't pair well with a sharp tongue. Hair, for those jesters who had it, was often worn wild, intentionally disordered, but not neglected. Combs were made from bone or wood, and hair oil was sometimes used to control frizz or give shine. He might darken his eyebrows with soot to make expressions more vivid during performance, or line his eyes subtly with charcoal, enhancing the drama of every squint or glare. This wasn't vanity. This was stagecraft. Every glance was a cue. Every facial feature had to play to the back row. Odor, too, was something a jester had to manage. Not eliminate, perhaps, but control. In a crowded great hall where candles and sweat mixed freely, the jester couldn't afford to smell worse than the crowd he entertained. He might rub rosemary or lavender into his clothes, if available, or hang sachets of dried herbs in his room. When he could, he'd bathe in a nearby stream, barrel, or public bathhouse, the latter being rare but still present in many medieval cities. His survival depended on people wanting to be near him. Smelling tolerable was part of the job. Clothing, naturally, played an enormous role in presentation. The stereotypical jester's outfit, brightly colored, mismatched, often split down the middle in contrasting hues, was designed to draw attention and signal his role instantly. But these costumes weren't mass-produced or easily replaced. They were hand-sewn, often by the jester himself or with help from castle staff. A tear in the fabric might be patched with a different color, turning necessity into flamboyant design. Bells were sewn into the sleeves, the collar, and the tips of a hood fashioned with donkey ears or horns. Not for stealth, obviously, but for spectacle. The sound of a jester approaching was unmistakable. It forced awareness. It invited curiosity. But not every jester dressed this way. Many had multiple outfits. The most theatrical ones were reserved for feast days, performances, or court ceremonies. On quieter days, especially in private gatherings or moments of satire, the jester might dress more simply. A tunic and hose, perhaps still colorful but less absurd. In these moments, the jester became less of a walking symbol and more of a surgical wit. Words did the work. The costume could wait. Footwear was practical. Soft leather boots or pointed slippers. Comfortable enough for dancing, durable enough for cold stone floors. Gloves were optional, but juggling and handling musical instruments required clean, flexible hands. Many jesters kept their fingernails trimmed, their fingers nimble. Their body was their tool. Every movement, every twitch had meaning. They couldn't afford stiffness or clumsiness, especially not on a stage where failure wasn't just embarrassing. It could be fatal to one's reputation. The jester also paid careful attention to posture. While nobles could afford to slump or look bored, a jester needed to be engaged, a head held high, spine loose, limbs expressive. He needed to move like a dancer, bend like a contortionist, balance like an acrobat. For some, this wasn't just theatrical instinct, it was survival instinct. The wrong performance, the wrong tone, the wrong body language could offend a guest or noble. An offense in a medieval court had consequences. One overlooked element of a jester's physical presentation was his voice. A jester didn't just tell jokes, he performed them. His voice needed range, resonance, volume. He practiced tones, high-pitched mockery, deep-voiced parody, breathy storytelling. His laugh needed to be contagious, not forced. He might hum to warm up, recite rhymes to test delivery, or sing to strengthen his diaphragm. He understood that sound was power. In echoing halls, the right voice could make or break a performance. In short, the jester was his own wardrobe, makeup crew, fitness trainer, vocal coach, and choreographer. There were no mirrors, no audience previews. Everything had to be prepared mentally, practiced in motion, and refined by instinct. And behind it all was the pressure of perfection. One bad appearance could stain a reputation. One bad smell, one failed joke, one limp performance, and the court might turn on him like wolves on a wounded deer. So yes, while medieval hygiene may seem grim by modern standards, for the jester, appearance and cleanliness were non-negotiable. He didn't aim for beauty. He aimed for presence. For sharpness. For control. Because in a world where nobles killed with silence and jesters survived with noise, the fool had to look like anything but a fool even when he was playing one. In a medieval court where every stitch of clothing screamed status, wealth, and purpose, the jester's wardrobe was a walking contradiction. He didn't wear silk to flaunt nobility, nor armor to command respect. He wore chaos, bright, mismatched, bell-adorned chaos. But this wasn't random flamboyance. Every piece of his costume was intentional. Every patch, bell, and horned cap told a story. And that story wasn't just about who the jester was, it was about who he was allowed to be. The typical jester's outfit is easy to picture, a motley suit of contrasting fabrics, often split right down the middle, red and green, blue and yellow, or even black and white. Stitched together in patterns that no tailor with self-respect would dare make for a noble. The colors clash deliberately. To modern eyes, it looks like a comedic mess. But in medieval Europe, this visual dissonance served one critical function: it set the jester apart. From everyone, clothing was not fashion in the modern sense. It was identification. A peasant wore rough wool and coarse linen. A nobleman wore dyed fabrics, embroidery, fur. A knight wore mail or livery. And then there was the jester, unplaceable. His clothing broke all the rules. And that was the point. By dressing in a way that no one else could or would, he carved out a social exemption for himself. He marked himself as other, and in doing so, gained a strange form of freedom. The motley, the name given to the jester's patchwork suit, wasn't just colorful, it was symbolic. The clashing colors represented contradiction, duality, and inversion. Everything the jester stood for. In a society where power was strict, linear, and inherited, the jester flipped it on its head. He mocked kings. He ridiculed saints. He turned pain into laughter. And his clothing embodied that reversal, a kind of wearable satire. Materials varied. Lower-tier jesters might make do with scraps, wool from discarded servant garb, linen torn from old tunics, hand-me-downs from the castle's tailors. Higher-status fools, especially royal jesters, had their costumes commissioned. These could include high-quality cloth, elaborate stitching, and bells made from brass or even silver. But no matter the material, the goal was always the same: to draw attention. Then came the headgear. The most iconic piece, the jester's cap. Often shaped with 3 points, like donkey ears or horns, each tipped with a jingling bell, it sat like a crown of absurdity atop the fool's head. The 3 points weren't accidental. They represented the ass's ears, a direct visual mockery of ignorance. This was bold symbolism. In a world where being called a fool could be a death sentence for a noble, the jester wore the accusation proudly. The bells were more than just decoration. They served a practical and psychological function. Audibly, they announced the jester's approach like a living soundtrack. Visually, they danced with every movement, emphasizing gestures and physical comedy. Psychologically, they were part of the armor. The jester was a distraction, a spectacle. If his words were cutting, his sound and color softened the blow. Some jesters also carried props. The most famous, the bauble or merit, a small scepter topped with a miniature jester head or carved face. It was like a puppet, a mirror of the fool himself. He could use it to speak in a second voice, perform dialogues, or mock others under the pretense that it's not me, it's the stick. The bauble was, in essence, plausible deniability carved in wood. Footwear varied depending on the region and the jester's rank. Commonly, soft leather shoes or pointed slippers allowed ease of movement essential for dancing, tumbling, or physical acts. Some had bells sewn into them as well. And while they might appear flimsy, jesters chose flexibility over protection. Their bodies were tools and their clothing had to support every contortion, leap, and fall. But the jester's appearance wasn't just for performances. It was part of the ongoing, never-ending act. Even when not on stage, the jester remained in costume. Why? Because his safety and his power lay in the consistency of his image. The moment a jester looked like everyone else, he was no longer protected by the absurdity of his role. The costume wasn't a disguise. It was a declaration: I am not bound by your rules. And because I wear this, I can say what you cannot. This worked both ways. The court tolerated, even protected, the jester precisely because he was obviously a fool. If he tried to look noble, speak formally, or act with the gravitas of a courtier, he risked losing that exemption. His freedom was tied directly to his performance of foolishness. The motley was a license and a trap. It gave him power, but only so long as he stayed within its brightly colored bounds. Of course, not all jesters embraced this image with joy. Some saw it as humiliating, a forced caricature that denied them dignity. But the best jesters, the ones remembered by name, like Will Sommers in England or Triboulet in France, wore their costume with pride. They turned it into a weapon. The bells became warning signs. The mismatched colors became camouflage for razor-sharp wit. They weren't hiding behind the outfit. They were using it as a spotlight. And let's not forget, many jesters were also actors, singers, dancers, and even musicians. Their costume wasn't just comedic, it was theatrical. Like a stage performer's makeup, it amplified their presence, exaggerated their movements, and made them larger than life. In a world where few people could read or write, the jester's performance was a form of storytelling. And his costume was the first line of the story. So when we picture the jester in his jingling, multicolored garb, we shouldn't think of him as a clown lost in history. We should see him for what he was: a master of presentation, a manipulator of perception, a man who turned absurdity into influence. And every thread of his clothing was stitched with that purpose. By the time the first goblet of wine was poured and the servants were lighting fires beneath cold stone hearths, the jester was already at work. Not performing, not yet, but preparing, watching, listening. He wasn't merely waiting for a cue. In many ways, he was the cue, the strange, colorful signal that the day had begun not with solemnity or command, but with mischief humming quietly beneath the surface. A castle, especially a royal or noble one, could be a place of crushing formality. Every movement was guided by etiquette, every interaction subject to unspoken hierarchies. Yet, ironically, that tension made laughter essential. The morning was a key moment. Before politics, before petitions, before punishments and taxes, there was a brief window where the mood of the court could be shaped. And that's where the jester thrived. One of his most important morning duties was to read the room, often literally. The great hall would begin to fill, stewards muttering schedules, guards clanking in half-polished armor, minor nobles grumbling about drafts and breakfast. The jester had to gauge the temperature before opening his mouth. A joke too early, too loud, or too targeted could sour the entire day. But the right joke, delivered at just the right moment, could lift a fog of tension before it settled. If the lord or king had slept poorly, if a noble was returning from a political defeat, if the castle's cleric was in a sour mood, the jester needed to know. Because one of his subtle but critical duties was emotional management. Think of him as the first medieval PR agent, damage controller, and court therapist rolled into one, with bells on his shoes. He broke ice, diffused awkward silences, and even redirected anger, all under the pretense of being an idiot in funny clothes. A typical morning might begin with something theatrical but seemingly casual. Perhaps the jester would trip while entering the hall, spilling imaginary wine, groaning exaggeratedly about the monsters under his mattress, a not-so-subtle jab at the local infestation of mice. Maybe he'd announce the arrival of an important dignitary only to reveal a dog in a crown. Or he'd read a fake proclamation declaring that today all nobles had to trade shoes with their squires to truly understand the burden of governance. It was absurdity on the surface, but targeted beneath. Each gag, each moment of comedy was shaped around the political and social undercurrents of the castle. If a noble had arrived late to a previous meeting, the jester might stage a mock awards ceremony, and the prize for most fashionably tardy goes to Sir Guillaume, slayer of time and keeper of excuses. Delivered with a grin, it could provoke laughter, or at the very least, relieve tension. In many cases, the jester would be summoned directly by the lord or monarch, sometimes even before the formal day began. Kings, like everyone else, could wake in foul moods made worse by gout, war, bad dreams, or conniving courtiers. The jester's role was not just to amuse, but to recalibrate, to make the king feel in control even when chaos brewed outside the castle walls. If the jester could provoke a chuckle, a smirk, even he had done more than entertain. He had shifted the balance of power without ever lifting a sword. In quieter moments, the jester might play music, often on a lute, flute, or hurdy-gurdy. Not loud, jubilant tunes at first, but light melodies drifting across stone floors as servants prepared the hall. Music was a powerful tool. It could mask conversations, soothe nerves, or punctuate jokes. Some jesters even sang satirical morning songs, taking familiar religious or ceremonial hymns and rewriting the lyrics to poke fun at real court issues. This was dangerous, of course, but also expected. The genius of the jester was that he was allowed to say what others could not, but only so long as he made them laugh. Sometimes he performed for small audiences, a group of guards at the gate, bored scribes waiting on official business, visiting merchants lingering for breakfast. These warm-up sessions served two purposes. They kept the jester's wit sharp and they acted as reconnaissance. People let their guard down when they were laughing. They gossiped more, revealed more. The jester was listening always, storing away tidbits of information that could become jokes or leverage later. It's important to understand that the jester's duties weren't confined to comedy in the traditional sense. His job was to redirect, to disrupt just enough to be useful but not enough to be punished. If two nobles were feuding, the jester might mock both equally, reminding them of their shared foolishness. If a steward was growing too powerful, the jester might exaggerate his fawning nature until it became a punchline. And if the king himself was behaving erratically, the jester could raise a mirror, warped and humorous, yes, but a mirror nonetheless. And yet, beneath the gags and rhymes, the jester had to walk a knife's edge. Every day could be his last. If he went too far, he risked angering someone important. If he held back, he was considered stale. Repetition was death in the court of entertainment. He had to stay unpredictable, fresh, and just dangerous enough to be interesting without being threatening. It was a mental dance that demanded constant creativity, resilience, and timing. And remember, the morning was only the beginning. The day ahead could hold feasts, trials, executions, weddings, banquets, political disputes, or royal ceremonies. The jester would be expected to shift tone as needed, adapting his performance like a shapeshifter. One moment he was a clown for children, the next a biting satirist for scheming lords. He didn't have the luxury of consistency. He had to become what the court required, even when they didn't know it themselves. So when the great hall finally settled, when the king gave his first command and the nobles took their seats, the jester would melt into the background or suddenly burst into laughter, mocking the lateness of the queen's cousin, or comparing the bishop's robe to an overturned goose. Whatever the court needed, he delivered, veiled in farce, wrapped in performance. But make no mistake, the jester's morning duties were more than just warm-up. They were strategic, deliberate, and foundational to the balance of power within the castle walls. In a world where silence was deadly and formality suffocated, he offered release. He shaped not only the mood of the morning, but the tempo of the entire day. As the great hall filled with rustling fabrics, clinking goblets, and half-whispered complaints about the draft or the kitchen's latest failure, the jester's work entered its most dangerous and delicate phase, face-to-face encounters with the powerful. This was where the fool's smile became a weapon and every word a gamble. It wasn't about getting a laugh, it was about reading people faster than they could lie, and then using that insight to make them laugh anyway. You might think that engaging with nobles would be straightforward, a jest, a bow, a giggle from the court ladies. But the medieval court was no tavern. Every noble was a walking minefield of pride, ambition, alliances, and secrets. And the jester had to walk through it barefoot, juggling insults and praise with equal skill. One misstep, one ill-placed remark could end his career or his life. Most nobles didn't like being mocked. They tolerated it when it came from a fool because the fool wasn't supposed to matter. That illusion that the jester was a harmless clown was the only shield he had. But behind that illusion was precision. The best jesters knew exactly how far they could go, and they walked that line like acrobats on a tightrope. Let's take a typical example. A baron enters the hall late, boots muddy, his expression grim from a failed land dispute. The room is stiff with tension. No one wants to speak. The jester sees his moment. He strolls casually into view, glancing at the baron's boots. Well, he says, loud enough for all to hear, I see the baron has brought a piece of the kingdom in with him. Should we plant crops on his shoes or simply declare them new territory? The baron narrows his eyes. The court holds its breath. And then a chuckle. Maybe just one. Maybe from the king himself. Tension releases like a drawn bow finally loosed. The jester moves on untouched. He's done what no noble could do, broken the mood with no loss of face. That's power. But power came with constant danger. There were always lines that couldn't be crossed. Some nobles held grudges. A joke about a failed campaign might trigger weeks of hostility. A quip about a noble's unmarried daughter might result in a midnight beating. The jester had to know the personal history of nearly everyone in the room, family ties, scandals, rivals, favorite foods, even sleeping habits. His memory was his shield. His wit was the sword. Interestingly, not all nobles treated the jester as an inferior. Some, especially those with a love for poetry or political gamesmanship, saw the fool as a kind of artist. A man who could say what others only dared think. They'd spar with him, not with weapons, but with words. They'd toss challenges, riddles, or philosophical musings his way just to see how he'd twist them. These exchanges were both dangerous and rewarding. One clever comeback might earn the jester a pouch of coins or a permanent place in the noble's favor. Others saw the jester as a tool. Need to humiliate a political rival in front of the king? Feed the fool a few juicy lines. Want to test the mood of the court after a controversial decree? Watch how the jester frames it in rhyme. He was the unofficial messenger, the whisperer in broad daylight. A skilled noble could use a jester like a dagger, indirect, but deadly. And yet, for all this strategic utility, the jester was also a master of disarming people. Many nobles, in private, would confide in him, not because they trusted him, but because they thought he didn't matter. He's just the fool, they'd say. He won't repeat it. They underestimated him. And the jester, smiling all the while, remembered every word. His private encounters often happened in corridors, outside chambers, or during quiet walks in the gardens when nobles let down their guard. They might ask him to compose a mocking verse about a rival or entertain a mistress in secret. They might beg for help in crafting a witty toast or even use him to leak information without being blamed. In all these moments, the jester was performing not with jokes, but with listening. And let's not forget, the jester could use this to his advantage. The court was full of traps and alliances shifted like sand. A jester who knew who was sleeping with whom, who owed debts, who had hidden children, or who had cursed the king in private, that jester was untouchable. He didn't need to blackmail. He just needed to know. And everyone knew that he knew. Not all encounters went well, of course. There were moments when the jester misread a room. When he poked fun at a man whose pride outweighed his humor. When he made light of a recent death, thinking it had passed from grief into memory, but it hadn't. These mistakes could be costly. A slap across the face. A kick to the ribs. A week without food. Or worse, a cold silence from the king. That was the true punishment. Being ignored. Being unseen. A jester without an audience was a dead man walking. Yet the best jesters learned. Fast. They adapted. They took mental notes, developed strategies, categorized personalities. Lady Beatrix would laugh at puns but hated physical comedy. Lord Simon had no sense of humor but liked being praised through insult. The bishop enjoyed theological satire, so long as it never questioned his authority. Every noble was a puzzle. The jester's job was to solve them all out loud, with flair, and without ever losing his head. In the dance of medieval power, where words were as sharp as swords and reputation was everything, the jester moved with incredible grace. His tongue was his blade, his grin a shield, his motley his armor. And though he bowed low and laughed loud, behind his bells and baubles lived a mind as sharp as any noble's dagger. He wasn't just part of the court. He was the court distilled into one volatile, brilliant, ridiculous man. At the heart of the medieval jester's craft was not laughter. It was truth. Wrapped in absurdity, dipped in rhyme, hidden in pantomime, but truth nonetheless. And in a world where truth was often dangerous, perhaps the most dangerous thing you could do was tell it while smiling. This is what made satire both the jester's sharpest tool and his greatest risk. Medieval politics wasn't a chessboard. It was a pit of knives. Alliances shifted with marriages, betrayals arrived at midnight, and entire families could fall out of favor with a single whisper. Speaking out against a noble, a bishop, or a monarch could result in exile or execution. But the jester existed in a legal gray zone. His role allowed him to say things no one else could say. But allowed did not mean safe. Far from it. Satire in the hands of a jester wasn't just entertainment. It was subversion. If a noble levied an unfair tax, the jester might compose a harvest hymn about crops being stolen by ghosts with velvet gloves. If the bishop preached humility while dining like a king, the jester might mimic a fat cleric choking on gold coins during a feast. Everyone would laugh, the bishop might even smile, but the message was clear. The jester was putting pressure on power. This was tolerated because it came with plausible deniability. He's just a fool. It's only a jest. No one takes him seriously. These were the excuses that protected him. Until they didn't. There were countless ways a joke could cross the line. Timing was one. A jest about a noble's gout might amuse the court one day and earn the jester a broken nose the next if delivered during a flare-up. Context was another. Mocking a failed military campaign might be tolerated in private, but saying it before foreign diplomats? That could be treason. And then there were topics so dangerous that even fools whispered them behind locked doors. Royal illegitimacy, papal corruption, accusations of heresy. Tread there, and even a jester could be silenced for good. Still, many did tread there. Some out of arrogance, others out of purpose. The best jesters understood the power of satire as a kind of social surgery, painful but necessary. By mocking hypocrisy, they forced the court to see itself. By ridiculing bad policy, they opened a crack in the armor of power. These weren't just jokes. They were messages disguised as nonsense. And people listened. Let's take a real historical example. Triboulet, the famous jester of French kings Louis XII and Francis I. He once insulted a powerful noble to such a degree that the man demanded his execution. The king, amused, agreed, but offered Triboulet the right to choose how he would die. Without missing a beat, Triboulet replied, of old age. The king laughed so hard he let him live. That wasn't just wit. That was survival-level thinking, performed live, under threat of death. But not every jester was so lucky. There are records of fools being beaten, imprisoned, even executed for going too far. Sometimes the court laughed and then changed its mind. Sometimes the joke hit too close to home. And sometimes the jester was simply a scapegoat. If a noble felt humiliated or if a rival wanted leverage, the jester could be accused of slander, disrespect, or even witchcraft. Few would defend him. He had no title, no family to protect him. His value was in his performance, and that value could vanish in an instant. Some jesters learned to self-censor, crafting their satire with layers so dense that only the sharpest minds caught the insult. They used allegory, character voices, invented folklore, anything to deliver criticism without direct confrontation. Others played dumb, feigning ignorance when called out. Oh, I didn't know the greedy wolf resembled your lordship. A coincidence, surely. Still, the most respected jesters were those who walked the edge without flinching. They weren't just tolerated, they were trusted. Kings valued them not only for their humor but for their honesty. A jester could say what advisors wouldn't dare. He could expose court corruption under the cover of comedy. In some cases, rulers kept jesters close specifically to be challenged. Because when everyone bows, you need someone who dares to mock. Of course, this relationship was volatile. Kings change. Courts shift. What was considered clever today might be criminal tomorrow. The jester had to adapt constantly, not only to trends in humor, but to the political weather. He had to know when to strike, when to pull back, and when to vanish entirely. Satire was his battlefield. Words were his weapons. And he fought not for power, but for space, the space to speak freely in a world built on silence. And it wasn't just politics. Satire touched religion, gender, marriage, and war. The jester might parody a sermon to reveal its contradictions. He might mock the court's obsession with purity while chasing skirts himself. He might sing a love ballad that slowly morphs into a tale of adultery and betrayal, only revealing its true subject with the final rhyme. These performances were riddles, booby-trapped with meaning. And the audience loved it, because satire allowed them to laugh at things they feared. It gave them release. It let them feel, for a moment, like the powerful were fools too. That the world, so rigid and unfair, could be mocked and maybe even changed. Through humor, the jester made tyranny look ridiculous. Through performance, he made suffering bearable. But it was always a risk. Every laugh could be the last one. Every smirk from a noble could mask fury. Every well-said fool could end in a cell. The jester lived minute by minute, breath by breath, in a world where his greatest strength was also his greatest threat. He had no armor, no allies, no escape. Only wit. Only timing. Only the power of a joke sharpened to a point. And still, every morning, he stepped into the hall and did it again. If the medieval jester's day revolved around the court, then his moment of truth was always the performance before the king. Not the casual quips during breakfast or the whispers exchanged in shadowy corridors, but the formal performance. The show. The spectacle. The moment when all eyes turned to the fool and silence descended not from reverence but from expectation. In these moments, the jester wasn't simply joking, he was orchestrating the entire emotional tempo of the court. Performing for the king was no spontaneous, unstructured flurry of noise. It was carefully built, rehearsed, and adapted, a live-wire act of calculation, timing, and manipulation of mood. Despite the jester's public image as a loose cannon in bells and motley, his greatest skill was control. He had to make it seem chaotic while being absolutely intentional. Every performance had to do three things: entertain the court, flatter the king, and speak truth without offense. Missing even one of those targets could end the jester's career. Hitting all three? That made him indispensable. These performances typically took place in the Great Hall or royal chamber, often during feasts, celebrations, or diplomatic visits. Imagine a stone hall draped with banners, lit by torchlight and candle glow, the air thick with roasted meat, wax, and wine. Nobles reclined at long wooden tables, goblets in hand, watching. The king sat elevated, surrounded by advisors, guards, and close family. And into this intimidating arena stepped the jester, flamboyant, ridiculous, and absolutely aware of the stakes. A good jester did not simply start talking. His act had rhythm. Many performances began with a song or rhyme, short, sharp, and often parodic. These tunes served as an icebreaker, warming up the room and signaling that the fool had entered not just physically but theatrically. He might sing about the weather, the last battle, or a recent court scandal, all cloaked in metaphor, of course. A noble who had been fined for illegal hunting might suddenly become the fox who couldn't tell forest from fence. The court laughed, the noble flushed, the king grinned. Then came physical performance. Acrobatics, juggling, mock fights, pratfalls. Some jesters were trained tumblers able to perform handsprings, flips, and balancing acts. Others used puppets, masks, or miniature props. He might pretend to be multiple characters in a single skit, changing voices and posture rapidly, the queen, the bishop, the baker, the chambermaid, all wrapped into a slapstick monologue that ended in absurdity but hinted at royal court dynamics. And always music. The jester's instrument was often an extension of his voice. A lute for storytelling ballads. A flute for comedic interludes. A drum or tabor for timing gags and stunts. Some jesters even used the hurdy-gurdy, an instrument with a haunting drone perfect for parodying solemn church hymns or battle anthems. He might strum a love song and sing of two doomed lovers only to twist the ending into a punchline about court bureaucracy or family rivalries. Classic jester tricks were as diverse as their personalities. Some favorites included mock duels with invisible opponents, complete with exaggerated death scenes. Royal decrees read aloud from fake scrolls, declaring absurd laws, henceforth all courtiers must bow to cheese before eating it. Impersonations where the jester mimicked nobles, ambassadors, or clergy, sometimes to the point of absurdity, other times uncomfortably accurate. Animal mimicry where he'd imitate hunting dogs, pigs, or even the king's prized falcons, not to insult the animals but the people who fancied themselves above them. Pantomimes of court events where recent happenings were reenacted with ridiculous substitutions: a chicken plays the queen, a mop plays the bishop, etc. But none of these were random. Each act, each gag, was built around the mood of the king. If the monarch was grieving, the jester performed a slow, poetic routine, perhaps mixing humor with melancholy, reminding the court of shared humanity. If the king was triumphant, the act might be bold, brash, celebratory, a parade of flattery and wit. The jester always watched the king's face. The shift of an eyebrow. The stillness of his hands. The way his goblet was held. These were cues read with more precision than any noble ever managed. A smile could be genuine or thin. Laughter could be joyous or mocking. A long silence might mean deep thought or quiet fury. The jester adjusted instantly. This was where the jester earned his place. Amid all the song and spectacle, the most important lines were the most dangerous. A verse about the war's cost. A riddle hinting at corruption. A tale that seemed like folklore but mirrored yesterday's secret meeting. These weren't jokes. They were messages. Sent directly to the throne, dressed in laughter. Many jesters built their acts around allegory. A story about a crooked merchant might be a critique of the king's treasurer. A joke about the jester's imaginary friend, Justice, who vanished one day and never returned, might speak to a legal scandal. Delivered correctly, these messages passed as harmless satire. But delivered poorly and the room turned cold. Every jester had a story or knew one about a performance gone bad. Maybe the king didn't laugh. Maybe a noble stood up in rage. Maybe someone stormed out or worse, stayed and said nothing. That silence was deadly. It meant the act had hit too hard, too directly, or too soon. There were recorded cases of jesters being whipped, banished, imprisoned, or even killed for poorly received performances. Not because they failed to amuse, but because they told truths the court wasn't ready to hear. Timing was everything. The joke that wins applause one night could bring ruin the next if the political wind shifted. But still, jesters returned. They had to. They were expected. The show wasn't optional, it was a function. Like the royal cook or the steward of arms, the jester performed a vital role maintaining the emotional and political atmosphere of the court. And when they succeeded, the reward wasn't just applause. It was trust, influence, security. Sometimes performances were crafted for outsiders visiting dignitaries, foreign nobles, ambassadors. In these cases, the jester's job was even more complex. He had to represent the kingdom. Mock, yes, but wisely. Make the guests laugh, not offend. Use double meanings. Deliver backhanded compliments. Perform unity while poking fun at division. In these moments, the jester became the unofficial voice of the king's cleverness. A witty fool meant a wise court. A bold fool meant a confident king. And so, his act became a message not just to those in the hall, but to the world outside it. Behind the jingling bells and painted face, the medieval jester carried something far more potent than laughter: access. Unfiltered, unpredictable, and unrestricted access. He walked the halls of power without armor, yet with more protection than many knights. He sat beside the king, not as a peer, but as a tolerated anomaly allowed to speak truth where others offered only flattery. And over time, that made him more than an entertainer. It made him a player in the game of power, a hidden thread in the political fabric of the medieval court. On the surface, the idea of a jester being involved in state affairs may sound like the stuff of legend or fiction. After all, what role could a fool possibly play in diplomacy, military planning, or governance? But the truth is, the jester's role extended far beyond the laugh. He was a listener, a watcher, a trusted observer who often had the king's ear at the most vulnerable moments, during meals, in chambers, after disputes, in times of grief or doubt. And in a world built on whispers, proximity was everything. The jester's gift was that people forgot he was listening. Or worse, they assumed he didn't understand what he heard. Nobles would speak freely around him, servants would grumble in his presence, visitors would drop their masks when the king's pet fool was nearby. But the fool remembered every detail. And when the king asked, often casually, the jester could offer insights no advisor would dare share. The jester as informal advisor. It happened often, usually after the official court had ended. The king, weary from ceremony and politics, would retreat to his private chambers or a smaller hall with only a few trusted attendants and the jester. In that dimmer light, stripped of pomp, the fool might offer a quiet observation. Not advice, exactly. Not formally. But something like, "A fine man, that ambassador. Smiles like a fox at a henhouse." Or, "Strange how the bishop blesses war so easily. Perhaps he prays for the butcher's guild next." These comments could seem flippant and often were meant to. But they landed. Kings were not fools. They knew that behind the jokes there was judgment. And because the jester wasn't part of the power hierarchy, he had no allegiance to protect, no estate to defend, no noble family to represent. His loyalty was personal to the king alone. Some rulers even encouraged this. Henry VIII famously kept Will Sommers by his side for years, valuing not just his humor but his candor. Sommers was present at tense meetings, royal feasts, and even intimate family moments. He saw the king at his most human and occasionally helped him be human when others feared to do so. In this way, the jester became a kind of emotional and moral barometer. When courtiers lied and schemed, the jester might laugh in a way that said, "I know." When advisors praised bad decisions, the jester might imitate their flattery so perfectly that the king could see the absurdity. He didn't stop power, but he could nudge it. The jester as political tool. Kings and nobles also used jesters strategically. Want to test a controversial idea before committing? Let the jester joke about it. If the court laughed nervously or grew quiet, that was a signal. If they roared with approval, perhaps the idea had merit. The jester was a living focus group, a sounding board for ideas that were too risky for official channels. Some rulers also used jesters to send indirect messages. Rather than confront a rebellious noble outright, a king might allow or instruct the jester to mock him in court. The insult, wrapped in performance, would sting without requiring formal reprimand. It was humiliation without war. A political move disguised as amusement. Even foreign diplomacy wasn't off limits. Visiting dignitaries often met the court jester early in their stay, and that meeting was never accidental. The jester's performance could send subtle messages: strength through bold satire, humility through self-deprecation, unity through clever jabs at internal divisions. The court watched how the guest reacted. Did he laugh? Did he grow stiff? Did he retaliate with a joke of his own? The fool wasn't just performing, he was reading. And if needed, the jester could deliver criticism to foreign powers without risk. If the French ambassador overstepped, the jester might say, "Ah, the fleur-de-lis grows bold when the gardener looks away." Laughter, but also warning. Diplomacy by joke. No other figure in the court could do this safely. The jester as spy. Perhaps most surprisingly, some jesters were used as spies. Not in the cloak and dagger sense of the modern spy, but as informal intelligence gatherers. Because they moved between social classes, nobles, servants, clerics, even townspeople. They picked up stories, rumors, and observations that no courtier could access. A jester might be sent to visit another noble's estate under the guise of entertainment, then return with gossip about discontent, military preparations, or marriage plans. His report would be delivered in rhyme or riddle, a song about a lord with restless horses, or a tale of a widow with too many swords under her bed. The king understood. The message was received. Some jesters even acted as internal monitors. In courts full of backstabbing, the fool might report on corrupt stewards, abusive knights, or conspiring advisors, not out of loyalty to truth or justice, but to preserve the king's favor, which meant preserving the stability of the court. This put the jester in an extremely precarious position. If discovered, he had no defense. He couldn't claim duty or honor, only jest. His protection was in his performance, and in the king's will. The confidant, perhaps the most unusual and intimate role a jester played, was that of confidant. When kings felt alone, betrayed, burdened, grieving, they turned to those they trusted most. And surprisingly often, that was the jester, because he wasn't a threat, because he wasn't ambitious, because he could listen without advising, and respond with humor that softened pain. In those rare, quiet moments, the jester offered something no advisor or noble could: perspective. Human perspective. He might not solve the king's dilemma, but he might say, "Heavy is the crown," they say, "but heavier still is the silence it brings." Or he might joke, "If your majesty is mad, at least we'll match outfits." These weren't just lines. They were lifelines. So while history often paints the jester as a decorative nuisance, a court-bound comedian dancing for scraps, the reality is far richer and far more dangerous. The fool, in many cases, was the only person who saw power unmasked. And in return, power allowed him to speak freely, so long as he never forgot that his head, too, could roll. In the medieval world, meals weren't just for sustenance. They were theater. The Great Hall wasn't merely a place to eat, it was a political stage where every glance, every word, every bite carried meaning. And in the midst of roasted boars, spilled wine, and whispered alliances sat the jester, loud, unpredictable, ever-present. Not as a guest of honor, but not quite a servant either. His presence at the table was another performance, one that required as much wit as any act in the royal chamber. The structure of dining in a noble or royal court was strictly hierarchical. The king or lord sat at the high table, flanked by his family or most trusted advisors. Below them were tables for lesser nobles, knights, clerics, and finally household officers. Servants scurried between them, delivering trenchers of bread, platters of meat, pitchers of mead. Everyone had their place, everyone except the jester. The jester, like his costume, defied structure. He might be invited to sit beside the king one evening and banished to the servants' bench the next. He might stand near the fire, wander between tables, or even perch on the edge of the dais, making comments as the courses progressed. His position changed based on the mood of the court, the tolerance of the moment, and the tone of his tongue. What the jester ate. Despite his proximity to power, the jester rarely dined as richly as the nobles. He might receive a trencher, a slab of stale bread used as a plate, with some meats, cheeses, or fruits, but often his meals came piecemeal, shared among servants, or gifted by amused courtiers. On rare occasions, he might be offered delicacies by the king himself, usually as a reward, or more likely, as part of a spectacle. For example, the king might publicly hand him a roasted quail, saying, "For your tongue is sharper than any dagger at this table." The hall would laugh, the jester would bow exaggeratedly, and the performance would continue. Sometimes he made a meal of jokes, pretending to be full after eating an imaginary feast or trading invisible dishes with noblemen, mimicking their chewing with dramatic pleasure. But meals weren't really about food for the jester. They were about presence. The banter begins. As wine loosened tongues and the firelight cast flickering shadows over tapestries and armor, the jester would spring into action. His jokes came in the form of impromptu rhymes about what was being served. 3 courses deep, yet still no meat, has the cook joined a monk's retreat? Mock toasts delivered in absurd seriousness. To Sir Hugh, whose mustache alone could terrify the Danes. Mimicry of the noble diners, recreating their gestures, posture, or even chewing styles. He'd hunch and groan like an old baron devouring a leg of lamb, then flutter his lashes and nibble like a court lady worried about appearances. Verbal sparring matches with knights or clerics who challenged him. What does the fool know of war? Only that generals love glory until it requires marching. Every jest was a probe, a way to test the mood of the room, the strength of alliances, the bitterness of rivalries. If 2 noblemen were quarreling quietly, the jester might pretend to host a duel between spoons. If a bishop looked too pleased with himself, the fool might ask whether the scriptures now came with a menu. The power of this banter wasn't just in the laugh it earned, it was in what it revealed. Laughter could expose alliances, discomfort, fear. The way a man reacted to being mocked spoke volumes. Did he laugh too loudly? Perhaps he was trying to hide guilt. Did he go silent? Maybe the joke had touched on something true. Navigating danger at the table. The dining hall was as dangerous as the battlefield, and the jester walked into it unarmed, except with wit. A noble offended during a meal had the immediate proximity to retaliate. A thrown cup, a sharp word, or a discreet word to a guard could be the beginning of the end for an unwelcome fool. So the jester read each situation with surgical care. He might jab at a baron's gluttony but then praise his horse-riding skills in the next breath. He might mock a duchess's perfume, then offer her a flower to mask the stench of court politics. Flattery framed as insult. Insult disguised as compliment. He moved with verbal sleight of hand, constantly balancing tension with release. And then, of course, there was the king. His mood shaped everything. If the monarch was jovial, the jester could be bold. If the monarch was brooding, every word had to be careful. A jest at the wrong time could chill the entire hall. But a well-timed observation, wrapped in comedy, could bring a stormy evening back into laughter. In some courts, the king even used the jester as a kind of dinner facilitator. The fool would make commentary between courses, introduce entertainers, or recite comical news of the kingdom. It became a ritual, part of the rhythm of court life. Just as the steward ensured food and the cupbearer ensured drink, the jester ensured tone. Food is symbolism. Sometimes the jester incorporated the actual meal into his performance. A pie might be revealed to hold a puppet. A roast could be given a voice and made to confess to theft. Bread could be used as a prop in a parable about famine and taxation. The feast became not just a setting, but part of the story. This gave the jester another powerful weapon, allegory. He could compare a tasteless dish to a recent royal decree. He could describe the blandness of stew as a metaphor for the court's hesitation in war. The entire dinner table became a canvas painted not with oils, but with metaphor, laughter, and carefully veiled warnings. The aftermath. When the meal ended and the bones were cleared and the nobles returned to their seats or staggered toward their chambers, the jester's role wasn't over. He lingered, observed, listened. Drunken nobles spoke freely. Jilted lovers whispered curses. Ambitious clerics tested phrases they might use later in sermons or speeches. The jester gathered it all. Because the dining hall wasn't just about eating. It was the one place where everyone, kings, queens, courtiers, servants, occupied the same room, under the same roof at the same time. And in that compressed space, with wine flowing and laughter echoing, power revealed itself. And the jester? He recorded it all, in rhyme, in mimicry, in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to serve it back to them, piping hot, at the next feast. In a medieval court where pride was brittle and egos sharp as daggers, conflicts were not just common, they were inevitable. Disputes over land, marriages, titles, and insulted honor could spiral from tense glances into open feuds in the blink of an eye. A poorly worded phrase, an unreturned greeting, a sideways smirk, these were sparks in a hall full of dry timber. And in the middle of it all, there was the jester, brightly dressed, seemingly harmless, yet often the only one who could stop blood from spilling without lifting a blade. It might seem absurd at first, How could a fool, a clown in motley and bells, serve as a mediator among knights and nobles, men who considered silence an insult and pride a virtue? The answer lies in something only the jester possessed, the right to offend without consequence. While knights fought and clerics prayed, the fool laughed, and his laughter was the only thing sharp enough to cut tension without drawing blood. The jester's role in quarrels. When disputes broke out, especially during court gatherings or ceremonies, it was often the jester who stepped in first. Not officially, not as an appointed peacemaker, but through presence and timing. He could interrupt an escalating argument by turning it into parody. Two nobles trading barbed words might suddenly find themselves portrayed by the jester on the spot, their voices mimicked, their gestures exaggerated. Sir Geoffrey, noble and fierce, whose sword once slew a chicken out of boredom. And Lord Alan, conqueror of glances and invader of appetizers. Laughter, sometimes nervous, sometimes genuine, would break the tension. The parties involved might scoff or roll their eyes, but the absurdity often disarmed them just enough to pause, breathe, and step back from the brink. The jester's technique here wasn't to make fun of the conflict itself, that could backfire, but to mock the pride behind it. He exposed the performative nature of noble anger. He reminded the court, without saying it directly, that most quarrels were fueled not by justice but by vanity. Mock trials and public reenactments. In cases where a dispute simmered long enough to become court gossip, the jester might stage a mock trial, using props, puppets, or even fellow servants to play roles. A horse might be the plaintiff, a loaf of bread the accused. But everyone knew who was being satirized. Through this theatrical farce, he could highlight the absurdity of the original conflict, laying bare its contradictions. One such performance might go like this. A jester calls the court to order with a wooden spoon as a gavel. The court of common nonsense is now in session. The case, Lord Gilbert versus Lord Reynard, a tragedy of stolen shadows and mistaken hats. He'd reenact the argument that had nearly turned into a duel over seating order or mistaken inheritance claims. By the end, the court would be in hysterics, and the original combatants, if they had any self-awareness at all, would be shamed into resolution. If not reconciliation, at least de-escalation. This wasn't just comedy. It was restorative theater. The fool as the voice of what couldn't be said. The jester also played a subtle role in giving voice to grievances that couldn't be aired directly. Sometimes, when a noble couldn't openly criticize another due to status, family ties, or political danger, the jester would do it for them. In a way that was loud enough to be heard, but vague enough to remain safe. He'd joke about how some lords arrive early to court only to spend the rest of the day waiting for their conscience to do the same. Or about how a man who claims land not yet plowed might soon find himself sowing apologies. The people involved always knew who the target was. The court knew. But the ambiguity preserved peace. These indirect jabs often helped parties save face. Instead of a public accusation, they got public performance, and that allowed both sides to retreat without humiliation. It was politics via punchline. When the jester failed, of course, not every attempt worked. Some conflicts were too deep, too personal. A jester who misread the tone or mocked a tragedy too soon could end up worsening the situation. There are historical accounts of fools being beaten, jailed, or exiled for attempting humor at the wrong time. A widow mocked in grief. A noble's bastard son mentioned in rhyme. A joke about a failed military campaign delivered while men were still burying the dead. The jester had no protection beyond his usefulness. His failures were not forgiven lightly. And yet he tried. Because when successful, the reward was immense, not just in coins or applause, but in influence. A jester who could resolve tension without violence became a kingmaker in laughter. His favor rose. His voice was sought out in private. His place at court solidified. The fool as emotional regulator. Beyond public disputes, jesters also played a role in private conflicts. Lovers' quarrels, sibling rivalries, jealous knights, resentful stewards all might find themselves tangled in emotion they couldn't express through proper channels. The jester, through jest or whispered word, could become a release valve. A knight shamed in battle might be teased until he laughed at himself again. A lady mocked for her unmarried status might find the jester comparing her to a rare jewel too fine for common crowns. These moments weren't just kindness, they were strategy. They stabilized the emotional undercurrents of the court. In modern terms, the jester served as a kind of unofficial therapist, comedian, and diplomatic buffer. Not because he had official power, but because his lack of rank made him uniquely effective. He could say things no one else could, and in a court drowning in secrets, that made him vital. Behind the bells, the real cost of mediation. But there was a cost. The jester had to carry the weight of other people's conflicts. He knew who hated whom, who feared whom, who longed for vengeance. He danced on that tightrope daily, pretending ignorance while absorbing every detail. He was surrounded by tension but could never show his own. A jester with enemies couldn't afford to have friends. He belonged to everyone and to no one. And when mediation failed, when conflict turned to violence despite his efforts, he had no authority to stop it. He could only perform, hoping his performance would be enough. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it wasn't. And still, the next day he returned. Mask on. Bells ringing. A walking contradiction, the fool who kept the peace in a world that lived on the edge of war. It's easy to imagine the medieval jester as a kind of wind-up toy, forever cracking jokes, tumbling through halls, or strumming out songs of insult and folly. But even a fool needed time away from the spotlight. Moments when he wasn't on stage, wasn't watched by kings, wasn't skirting the edge of offense for applause. And while leisure for a jester was never truly free of performance, there were hours often stolen between obligations when he lived off-script. These quiet periods reveal a different dimension of the jester. Not the loud spectacle, but the sharp mind. The thinker. The writer. The observer. In those moments of stillness, he wasn't less a jester. He was, perhaps, more of one, because that's when he refined the craft that kept him alive. Solitude among noise. The castle never truly slept. Even in the night hours, there were fires to tend, guards on watch, servants scouring pans, and lovers sneaking through corridors. But the jester learned to find quiet within the noise. He might retreat to a forgotten corner of the kitchens or sit by the stables, legs tucked under him, watching stars filter through gaps in stone. This wasn't laziness, it was survival. These moments were for reflection. What jokes worked that day? Who laughed too hard? Who didn't laugh at all? What gossip had surfaced over dinner? Which noble looked at another a moment too long? The jester catalogued it all. Not with scrolls or scribes, but in memory and metaphor. His brain was a script constantly revised, constantly updated. Writing, composing, rehearsing. A surprising amount of the jester's leisure time was spent working, though he'd never call it that. He'd draft verses in chalk on stone walls or scratch them into slivers of wood. He might compose songs on a battered lute with two strings too few, testing out melodies that balanced charm with subversion. He practiced rhymes aloud, sometimes walking in circles while muttering to himself. This rehearsal was essential, because the jester never had the luxury of repetition. A joke reused was a joke dead. And so he pushed himself constantly. New verses, new songs, new stories. Sometimes nonsense, sometimes biting satire, often both at once. In certain courts, jesters even had access to books or scrolls, usually from the royal or monastic libraries. While many could not read formally, some learned over time, borrowing help from clerics or scribes. For those who could, texts were treasure troves, histories to parody, sermons to mock, poems to repurpose into courtly insults. Games, drinking, and time with the servants. Despite his royal proximity, the jester often felt more at ease among the lower ranks of the castle, the servants, cooks, stable hands, and guards. They shared his humor, his class, and his distrust of nobility. Among them, he could relax, not entirely, but more than he ever could in the Great Hall. These moments might include dice games or card games played on makeshift boards with crude tokens. Drinking contests with the guards where the jester always lost theatrically, sometimes by design. Stories shared by the hearth where he listened more than he spoke, gathering tales from the fields and towns beyond the castle walls. Mock duels or clownish dances with kitchen boys who adored his exaggerated martial arts and endless insults. These weren't performances, not exactly. But they still served a purpose. The jester built alliances in the lower ranks. He became part of the castle's living memory, not just as a fool who made the lords laugh, but as one of the people who understood the world beyond velvet curtains and silver goblets. And, crucially, they talked freely. Servants gossiped. Guards muttered secrets. Cooks repeated what they heard nobles say over dinner. The jester soaked it all in. His leisure time became reconnaissance. The castle spoke to him when it thought he wasn't listening. Training the body. Not all jesters were tumblers or acrobats, but many maintained their agility with discipline. Leisure hours were sometimes spent practicing balance, footwork, or breath control. He might walk a low wall in the garden, arms spread, balancing with a wine bottle on his head. He might juggle stones near the stables, dodging horses while counting rhythms. He'd stretch, twist, bend, anything to keep his body responsive. Why? Because a jester's performance wasn't just mental. It was physical warfare. Every pratfall had to be believable. Every leap, every twirl, every exaggerated stagger had to land perfectly. A misstep wasn't just embarrassing, it could cost his position. Or his teeth. Friendships, if you could call them that. Did jesters have friends? That's complicated. They had connections, loyal servants, sympathetic guards, the occasional musician or scullery maid who saw past the paint. But true friendship was rare. Because trust was rare. Because a jester who knew too much, spoke too freely, or got too close could be turned on, used, betrayed. Even when not performing, he was always on alert. Every smile could hide malice. Every shared drink might end in betrayal. So he kept most people at arm's length, friendly, yes, but never vulnerable. Still, a few people often broke through. A former jester turned stablemaster. A cook with a sharp tongue and a sharper memory. A monk who appreciated satire more than scripture. These were the quiet threads that made life tolerable when the court grew too loud. Moments of stillness. And then there were the rarest hours, true solitude. No audience. No servants. No hidden listeners. Just the jester, alone. Perhaps outside the walls at dusk, watching mist gather over the fields. Perhaps in a tower stairwell, humming a sad tune meant for no one. These were the moments when the performance truly dropped. No one knows what jesters thought in those moments. Did they resent the motley? Did they long for peace? Did they feel pride, or loneliness, or just exhaustion? Probably all of it. But they always came back. Because the jester, more than anyone, understood the absurdity of the world he lived in. And somehow he had made a place within it. Not by fighting it. Not by fleeing it. But by laughing at it, with it, and sometimes through it. To the eye of the court, the jester was a harmless distraction, a walking contradiction, full of nonsense, noise, and noise-making. He was a figure to be laughed at, not taken seriously. Yet beneath the bells and buffoonery, some jesters played a far more intimate and influential role, that of private counselor to the king. This wasn't a formal position. The jester didn't sit in council meetings, didn't wear robes of state, and didn't issue proclamations. But he had something far rarer: trust. Not the kind born of shared lineage or oaths sworn in blood, but of familiarity. He was present when others weren't. He saw the king at his most human, tired, angry, grieving, drunk. And in those moments, the monarch didn't want an advisor bound by law or politics. He wanted honesty. The jester was often the only one who could provide it. The fool in the private chamber. The most serious conversations didn't happen at banquets or council tables. They happened in the late hours, behind closed doors, when the fire had burned low and the weight of the crown pressed hardest. The king, seated in private, might wave away his advisors and servants, keeping only the fool nearby. Not for entertainment, but for counsel. No scrolls. No formal language. Just quiet questions. Did I make a mistake today? Do they fear me too much? Will they betray me? The jester answered not with scripts or strategy, but with parables, jokes, riddles, and behind each one, an unmistakable truth. The king who asks if he is feared already knows the answer, else he wouldn't ask. Or, only a fool tells a man he is mad unless that fool has nothing to lose. These weren't just quips. They were shields of language that allowed difficult truths to be spoken aloud. A noble advisor might get his head taken for what the jester could say with a smile. The king understood the game. The jester wasn't unbiased, but he was unfiltered. And in a court full of men vying for favor and titles, that was rare. That was priceless. Emotional honesty. More than politics, a jester offered emotional clarity. Rulers were constantly under pressure from their own ambitions, their enemies, their allies, even their families. They were expected to be more than men, symbols, warriors, gods in human form. But they still grieved. They still doubted. They still broke. When a child died, it was the jester who could break the silence with a foolish tale that made the king laugh through tears. When a queen grew cold and distant, it was the jester who might mutter, "She hears too much from her ladies and too little from her heart." When a trusted friend betrayed the throne, the jester could say, "A wound hurts more when the blade was handed to them by your own hand." These truths, softened by laughter or absurdity, gave the king space to feel without judgment. The jester was a mirror, not polished to flatter, but warped just enough to show things clearly without cutting too deeply. Subtle influence. Not all counseling was direct. A wise jester knew how to plant ideas. He didn't say, "You should raise taxes." Instead, he'd perform a tale about a greedy farmer whose chickens laid fewer eggs when forced to march in armor. A parable about overreach. A warning disguised as whimsy. The king might laugh or not. He might say nothing. But the idea stayed with him. This was the jester's real power, to influence thought without provoking resistance. Nobles made demands. Clerics issued decrees. The jester merely played. But within his plays were arguments more persuasive than any speech. In many cases, kings began to rely on their jesters more than their advisors, not for policy, but for perspective. When every noble claimed loyalty, the jester reminded the king of their ambitions. When priests demanded piety, the jester reminded him of their hypocrisy. When generals shouted for war, the jester whispered about the grave. He didn't make decisions, but he shaped how those decisions were viewed. Historical precedents. History offers several examples of jesters whose roles clearly extended into counsel. Triblet, the jester of Francis I of France, was notorious not just for his sharp tongue but for his bold advice. He once warned the king, "Your enemies are fools, sire. That's why they're dangerous, they don't know when they've lost." While Somers, jester to Henry VIII, remained close to the king through marriages, deaths, and wars. In a court where even powerful men fell from favor, Somers endured, not because he was amusing, but because Henry trusted him in moments where no one else could speak. These men weren't just clowns. They were truth-tellers disguised as entertainers, licensed by absurdity. The risk of truth. But truth is never safe. The closer a jester got to the king's ear, the more danger he walked into. A misinterpreted line, a joke that cut too deeply, a suspicion whispered by a jealous courtier, any of these could turn the king against his fool. A jester might be the king's confidant one day and be dismissed the next, cast out under accusation of treason, mockery, or insult. The fool had no title to protect him, no land to retreat to, no army to defend him. His only power was his continued usefulness. That meant every word mattered. Every performance, even in private, had to balance insight with safety. And yet, the most courageous jesters didn't flinch. They told the king what no one else could, not because they were braver, but because they understood something no courtier ever did. The king is still a man who fears, who errs, who grieves. And if no one dares to remind him of that, he forgets. And when kings forget they are human, empires fall. The jester's laughter then was more than entertainment. It was a boundary, a pulse check, a whispered truth wrapped in ridiculous clothes. It was the last line of defense against madness. The great lords might have laughed at the jester's rhymes, and kings may have sought his counsel in candlelit chambers, but beyond the banquet halls and throne rooms, in the kitchens and stables, among the scullery maids, grooms, and night guards, the jester lived another life altogether. One not ruled by etiquette, rank, or protocol, but by familiarity, camaraderie, and often suspicion. Because to the common staff of the castle, the jester was both one of them and something else entirely. He was close enough to eat with them, but too dangerous to fully trust. He shared their jokes, but also their secrets. And secrets, in the hands of a fool, could become verses sung in front of the king. The jester as a familiar figure. Unlike noble guests or high-born knights, the jester walked freely through the castle, not just through gilded halls, but into the smoky kitchens, dim cellars, stables, laundry rooms, and back corridors. He slipped between social worlds with an ease that baffled most. 1 hour he was mocking a duke's haircut, and the next, he was seated beside a stable boy, peeling onions and imitating the cook's latest tantrum. To the staff, the jester was often seen as something in between. Not quite a noble. Not quite a servant. His clothes were absurd but clean. He slept among them but not with them. His hands were calloused like theirs, yet he had the ear of the king. This bred a mix of respect, amusement, and quiet suspicion. He was amusing company, certainly. He'd make fun of the stewards, impersonate nobles, or stage mock versions of important events, always spinning the world of the elite into farce. Servants loved this. These performances gave them emotional release. In a society where complaining aloud could mean punishment, the jester's parody was their voice. But he wasn't fully theirs, because he listened. Always. Too carefully. And sometimes things said in jest by the hearth showed up in his performances. Maybe not word for word, but the themes. The ideas, the truths. He would twist them, filter them through song or story, and suddenly the castle's gossip was on display before the entire court. This led to an unspoken rule: never forget that the fool remembers. Information trader. The jester often served as a subtle channel between the lower and upper classes, not officially, of course, but functionally. He heard the complaints of the cooks, how food was spoiled because supplies arrived late. He heard the guards' frustration over low pay and broken weapons. He knew who stole wine, who skipped prayers, who was beaten in silence. But instead of reporting these things like a steward would, he repurposed them. In performance, he might sing, "The Lord drinks dry and still complains. The cook boils water, calls it grains. The guards hold blades with empty sheaths. And still they bow with broken teeth. No names, no accusations. Just a spotlight turned sideways. A wink. But the king heard. The nobles heard. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes things changed. The jester was a pressure valve. He spoke of frustrations that would otherwise fester. He gave the staff a mouthpiece in the form of madness. In return, the staff gave him information. Not always freely, but willingly enough. A cup of wine bought a story. A shared joke bought a confession. They liked him because he understood them. He didn't mock their position. He elevated it, turned their daily toil into royal entertainment. And still, the suspicion remained. Because it was never clear where the jester's loyalties lay. Was he simply amused by gossip? Or was he collecting it? Did he protect the staff by revealing injustice through satire? Or did he protect the king by exposing unrest? No one ever really knew. And that mystery made even his allies cautious. The jester's reputation among servants. Much depended on the jester himself. Some were beloved, humble, kind, generous with food and coin. Others were arrogant, cruel, or manipulative. Some used their influence to shield vulnerable servants. Others used it to punish those who mocked them when they were offstage. A respected jester was one who didn't betray his sources, who made the nobles laugh without endangering the servants who fed him stories. A feared jester was one who could destroy reputations with a rhyme. A clever jester knew this balance. He kept his role as bridge, never becoming too attached to one side or the other. He helped where he could, played dumb when needed, and always made sure his presence felt like a blessing rather than a threat. Yet even the best jesters sometimes walked into trouble. A guard who'd been mocked one too many times might accidentally shove the fool into a trough. A kitchen maid, tired of hearing her words in rhyme, might stop speaking when he entered. A groom might murmur to the horses that the fool had more ears than sense, and more mouths than ears. A part of the machinery. Ultimately, the jester was woven into the life of the castle. He wasn't just background noise, he was part of the machinery that kept things running. In a way, his connection to the staff was his foundation. He moved between the glittering halls and the sooty cellars, carrying truth wrapped in entertainment. And in a system where servants were often invisible, the jester saw them. He acknowledged them. He turned their lives into stories, and their voices into songs. Crude, funny, sometimes dangerous, but remembered. To the nobles, he was a fool. To the king, he was a mirror. To the people who scrubbed floors and saddled horses, he was a spark. Not always safe, but always alive. And in a world that ignored them, that alone was something worth respecting. Of all the contradictions that made up the life of a medieval jester, the freedom wrapped in servitude, the power hidden in absurdity, perhaps none was more delicate or complex than the question of his life outside the court. Did the fool who entertained kings and mocked bishops ever go home to a wife? Did he know love? Did he raise children, tend a garden, nurse heartbreak? Or was he forever locked in the role he played, a mask with no man behind it? The answer, like so much about jesters, is layered in uncertainty. But what history does show us suggests that the fool's life was more human and more tragic than many would imagine. Marriage and companionship. Contrary to popular belief, many jesters did have families. Some were married. Some had children. Others formed informal unions with women in or around the castle, washerwomen, cooks, widows, or even, rarely, courtesans or minor ladies-in-waiting. But these relationships were always shadowed by class, status, and stigma. A jester, no matter how favored by the king, held no noble title. He wasn't landed, he wasn't hereditary, and he was never equal. Marriage into nobility was essentially impossible. Even unions with the merchant class were rare and usually discouraged. He existed outside the structure, amusing, important, but never permanent. If he did marry, it was often someone from the servant ranks, a maid who'd seen his face without paint, a laundress who liked his voice when he wasn't shouting rhymes. These marriages were often quiet, almost secret, and rarely official. The jester's existence was so deeply tied to the court that formal recognition of a spouse could be politically inconvenient for him and for his master. Still, love happened. Despite the absurdity he embodied, the jester was often among the most emotionally intelligent people in the castle. He saw more, listened more, understood more. He knew loneliness intimately, lived on the edge of rejection daily, and turned pain into performance. That empathy drew people in. And yet, these relationships were fragile. Some jesters lived double lives, fools by day, husbands by night, sneaking into servants' quarters or cottages near the castle to share whispered hours with a lover. Some managed to secure small living spaces outside the castle walls, rare but possible, especially in wealthier courts. There, they might raise a child or tend a modest garden. But such lives were vulnerable. A change in court favor, a new ruler, or a scandalous joke could tear it all away in a moment. Parenthood. Historical records are scarce, but there are scattered accounts of jesters with children, some legitimate, some not. A jester's child might live outside the castle raised by the mother or a relative. Others, born to women in service within the castle, grew up in its lower tiers, perhaps never knowing their father fully or only knowing him as the funny man who dances for the king. Rarely, a child of a jester might be trained in performance too, juggling, mimicry, song, and follow in their father's footsteps, especially in traveling troupes or among lower court entertainers. But being a jester was not typically an inherited role. It was seized through talent, timing, and often a tragic blend of misfortune and genius. The jester's child had no claim to wealth or title. Even if the jester was beloved, his family remained outside the structures of privilege. There were no inheritance rights, no lands passed down, no coat of arms. At best, the child of a royal fool inherited stories. At worst, only stigma. And yet, the idea of a fool rocking a child to sleep, humming a song too sharp for cradle use, is no less true than any other part of medieval life. He may have been a ghost in the court, always present but never solid, but in his private world, he could be real. Vulnerable. Tired. Human. Forbidden love. Some jesters loved above their station, and those stories rarely ended well. There were whispers in court records, often buried in scandal, of jesters becoming too familiar with ladies of the court. A duchess who enjoyed his verses a little too much. A bored wife of a nobleman who found in the fool something honest, something unlike the cold men around her. These dalliances were dangerous. Deadly even. A nobleman's pride was sacred, and nothing could wound it more than to learn that his wife or daughter had taken an interest in the man in motley. If discovered, the fool could face banishment, imprisonment, or death. And the lady? Shamed, locked away, or quietly married off. Still, the jester's role gave him a strange intimacy with women at court. Unlike knights or lords, he wasn't expected to be formal or distant. He could speak plainly, joke rudely, tease flirtatiously. He could comment on fashion, recite romantic ballads, or perform as a suitor in mock courtship games. And in that space, feelings sometimes formed, reckless, brief, but real. It was not uncommon for queens and noblewomen to favor their court fool, platonically or otherwise. He was safe. He was charming. He listened without judgment. He could make them laugh in a world where laughter was rare. But if those affections crossed the line, or were perceived to cross it, the consequences were swift. A life of isolation in plain sight. Despite occasional companionship, many jesters lived fundamentally lonely lives. Not physically alone, the castle was never empty, but emotionally isolated. They were watched constantly, judged constantly, expected to be funny even when grief choked their breath, expected to entertain while hiding pain. There was no room for public sadness in the motley. A crying jester was a broken mirror, terrifying, wrong, unnatural. And so even love, even connection, was something managed in secret. This loneliness was often reflected in the jester's work. Beneath the slapstick and satire, a deep melancholy ran. His jokes about love were too sharp. His songs ended in loss. His rhymes bent, always, toward the absurdity of hoping for anything real. Because what is more absurd than the idea that the fool, the man whose job was to mock the world, might simply want someone to love him for who he was when the bells came off? Could he leave it behind? Could a jester walk away from court, retire, live a peaceful life with a wife and children in some quiet village? Yes, but rarely. Some did. Especially those who served long and well, who avoided scandal and earned the affection of a forgiving master. They might be granted land, a cottage, a pension. They might live out their years as local legends, the old fool who once made the king laugh so hard he spilled his wine. But most didn't make it that far. Many jesters simply disappeared from the records. Dismissed. Replaced. Forgotten. A new fool arrived, younger, sharper, with fresher rhymes. And the old one, well, he was no longer funny. And in the brutal truth of the court, a jester who couldn't make them laugh had no more value. So did jesters love? Yes. Desperately. Quietly. Often tragically. Did they have families? Some did. And some lost them. Did they dream of escape? Maybe. But more often they simply dreamed of being seen, not as a fool, but as a man. And that, perhaps, is the most human thing of all. If a medieval court was a pressure cooker of hierarchy and hidden tension, then festivals, tournaments, and royal ceremonies were the moments when the lid came off. These grand occasions, full of noise, color, competition, and indulgence, were not only celebrations but tools of propaganda, diplomacy, and public display. And within the center of that chaos stood the jester, not merely as a sideshow but often as the unofficial master of energy. The fool's presence at such events wasn't accidental or peripheral. He was as vital to their success as the knights in armor or the minstrels plucking away at their lutes. The jester turned ritual into theater. He gave the people something to remember beyond the banners and blood. And for the king, he ensured that no matter how tense or serious an event might be, there was always one figure capable of resetting the room, with mockery, with madness, or with a perfectly timed pratfall. Festivals, carnival chaos, and controlled anarchy. Court festivals were wild by medieval standards. Some were religious in nature, marking saints' days, the changing of the seasons, or important liturgical events. Others were secular, royal birthdays, weddings, coronations, victories in battle. All of them demanded spectacle. And that was where the jester thrived. During feast days, jesters were not just performers, they were central characters. Often, they opened the festivities with processions calling out absurd laws for the day. Henceforth, all lords must carry geese instead of swords, for peace is poultry's prize. Or, on this holy feast, wine shall be blessed by song, and the king may not frown without the fool's permission. Crowds would cheer. Nobles would smirk. The king might even play along. These proclamations were nonsense, but they framed the day. They reminded everyone that, for once, the world was upside down. Hierarchy softened. Etiquette loosened. The jester, in that moment, was king of inversion. Some courts even allowed for a lord of misrule, a temporary ruler appointed during festivals to mock official authority. Often, this role was filled by the court jester. He would don royal robes, sit on a mock throne, and command the court in ridiculous ways. He'd hold mock trials, punish nobles for crimes like wearing too much perfume or boring conversation, and lead parades of absurdity through the halls. This tradition wasn't just foolishness. It was ritualized rebellion, a way to release tension in controlled chaos. The jester made fun of the world so the world didn't break. The very existence of such a role acknowledged that power needed to be challenged safely and temporarily to keep the kingdom sane. Tournaments, blood, steel, and satirical commentary. Tournaments were deadly serious. Beneath the pageantry, the bright flags, the trumpets, the cheering crowds were real injuries, real rivalries, and real displays of dominance. Knights clashed not just for sport, but for honor, prestige, and political leverage. Yet even here, amid the thunder of hooves and gleaming armor, the jester had a role to play. Before the matches began, jesters often parroted the contestants. They might wear makeshift armor, barrels for chest plates, cooking pots for helmets, and stage mock justs on hobby horses. One fool might be Sir Eats-a-Lot, another Lord Flailing-Gun of Wobble-on-the-Marsh. These slapstick performances let the crowd laugh before the real violence began. They also subtly commented on the actual knights, their pride, their preening, their petty vendettas. During the tournaments, the jester might act as an unofficial announcer, shouting exaggerated commentary from the sidelines. And here rides Sir Geoffrey, known for charging forward, mostly into trees. Behold Sir Reginald's mighty lance. May it last longer than his last marriage. The nobles laughed because it was sanctioned irreverence. The people laughed because it spoke truth. The jester, unlike the herald or steward, could say what everyone else was thinking. Sometimes, the fool even participated in tournament games designed for entertainment, mock duels, juggling contests, foot races in armor, or insult competitions, where he'd face off against other jesters or willing nobles to see who could craft the most inventive and permissible verbal put-down. And when the day was done, when the bruises were tended and the wine flowed again, the jester had the privilege of reminding the losers why laughter mattered more than honor. Royal ceremonies, weddings, coronations, and funerals. Even in the most solemn of royal occasions, the jester had a role, though vastly different in tone and purpose. At weddings, the jester brought levity to the rigidity of tradition. He might perform a farcical play about love gone wrong, or compose a song predicting how the bride would train the noble hound of a husband with naught but a look. Everyone laughed, and the awkwardness of arranged unions melted, if only slightly. At coronations, his role was delicate. He walked a fine line between celebrating the new ruler and acknowledging, through jest, the absurdity of monarchy itself. He might say, "All hail the king, wise enough to be born to the right father." Or, "Let it be known that his majesty's crown fits, despite all that's beneath it." These lines, crafted carefully, honored the moment by grounding it, a reminder that power is always one step away from farce. At funerals, a jester's presence seems unthinkable, and yet some kings requested it. Not every court allowed humor in mourning, but certain rulers, especially those with long-standing jesters, asked for a final performance to lift the veil of grief. a jest about the king's snoring, a song about how death finally ended the argument with the bishop, a poem that made courtiers laugh and cry at once. These moments were not disrespectful. They were intimate. The jester, after all, had seen the king as a man. And in death, someone had to remind the court of that. The fool is social glue. At every grand event, the jester served a deeper purpose, unifying the experience. Nobles, knights, commoners, and clergy rarely had anything in common. But laughter was a shared language. And the jester, master of that language, could knit together a fractured audience. He reminded the rich that they were mortal. He reminded the poor that the rich were ridiculous. He softened fear with parody, celebrated love with irony, and diffused envy with shared absurdity. His act wasn't filler. It was framework. Without the fool, these events could become stiff, silent, or even dangerous. He was the buffer, the bridge, the one person who could say, "Isn't all this a bit much?" and not get thrown in the moat for it. And through it all, the wine, the fanfare, the combat, the ritual, he never stopped watching. Because the jester understood better than anyone, the bigger the show, the easier it is to miss what really matters. And he made it his mission to make sure no one forgot. If there was one thing that set the jester apart from everyone else in the medieval court, it was this: he could say what others could not. He could mock the bishop, parody the queen, imitate the king's limp, and call a nobleman a liar, all without immediate punishment. He could interrupt a ceremony, heckle a general, or joke about war taxes before the lords who levied them. And for a time, the world let him. But this so-called freedom of speech was not freedom in the modern sense. It wasn't a right. It was a conditional privilege, one earned by entertainment, maintained by relevance, and stripped away the moment the laughter stopped. The jester's tongue was his most valuable asset, and his most dangerous liability, the illusion of protection. At first glance, the jester appeared untouchable. He was the king's fool, the comic spirit of the court, draped in motley and crowned with bells. Nobles would flinch at his barbs but laugh anyway. Clergy would frown but not dare speak against him unless the king gave leave. Servants adored him, and even foreign dignitaries had to endure his jokes as part of the theater of diplomacy. It seemed like safety, but the truth was that the jester walked a narrow ledge, and one misstep could send him falling into disgrace or worse. There was no written contract protecting a jester's speech. There was no clause in the law, no formal title that insulated him from punishment. His safety rested entirely on the tolerance of those in power, especially the monarch. If the king laughed, the jester lived. If the king didn't, all bets were off. And this made every performance a calculated risk. When words went too far. So what did it mean to go too far in a medieval court? Sometimes the line was political. Criticizing a royal policy, even with humor, could be dangerous, especially if the policy was fresh, controversial, or personally important to the king. For example, if the kingdom had just suffered a military loss, and the jester made light of the army's retreat, even in the cleverest rhyme, it could be seen as mockery not of the battle, but of the crown itself. That was treason cloaked in comedy. Sometimes the danger was personal. Making jokes about the queen's infertility, a noble's bastard children, or the bishop's rumored mistresses might earn laughs from the audience. But if it struck too close to real scandal, the result could be swift and brutal. There are accounts, though scarce, of jesters being imprisoned, whipped, mutilated, or exiled for speaking truths the court refused to face. A joke told at the wrong time about the wrong man in front of the wrong witness could become the last joke the fool ever told. And unlike courtiers or knights, the jester had no allies to protect him, no house to rally to his cause. He was alone, entertaining, yes, but expendable, the silent message behind every joke. A jester's power was never just in what he said. It was in the fact that he said it and survived. His very existence was a statement. I can speak the truth and still be fed. That made him dangerous. The court watched him not just for amusement, but as a barometer of the king's mood and tolerance. If the jester mocked a noble and the king laughed, it signaled approval. If he made fun of the church and wasn't punished, it suggested a softening of religious dominance. His jokes were not just entertainment, they were messages. Everyone took notes. So when the jester made a cutting remark about corruption or incompetence, and the king allowed it, it wasn't just a joke, it was permission. and that power, however indirect, could upset the balance of the court. Which is why, every now and then, that permission was revoked. The fools who fell. History gives us glimpses of jesters who paid the price for their boldness. Archibald Armstrong, jester to King James I of England and later Charles I, was dismissed after mocking too many members of the king's court. His final insult was likely aimed at a powerful bishop, and while the people may have laughed, the bishop didn't. Archibald's license was revoked. He was exiled from court and faded into political obscurity. Others weren't so lucky. There are stories, half legend, half truth, of jesters whipped to death, their tongues cut out or found drowned after one joke too many. Most went unnamed in the records. After all, they were fools. What the audience often forgot or chose to ignore was that a jester's performance was a gamble. Every time he opened his mouth, he bet his survival on the outcome. The art of self-censorship. To stay alive, jesters developed a language of subversion. They rarely spoke truths directly. Instead, they cloaked their meanings in allegory, telling stories about other kingdoms that mirrored current events. Animal fables, using pigs, foxes, and dogs to stand in for real figures. Riddles and rhyme, obscuring meanings behind clever phrasing. Puppet theater, blaming the puppet, not the fool, for what was said. These tools allowed them to slip criticism past the court's defenses. And when confronted, they could always claim it was just a joke, a story, a song. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But the jester knew one thing better than anyone else: truth unspoken is still truthful. And once a room laughed at something, it could never unhear what was said. Why they risked it? So why risk it at all? Why not just play safe? Stick to slapstick, avoid politics, flatter the king, and go home with your skin intact? Because the jester wasn't just a clown. He was a truth-bearer. A performer, yes, but also a philosopher in rags. His job wasn't simply to amuse. It was to hold up a mirror to the powerful, to expose hypocrisy through humor, to make the unbearable just slightly more bearable by laughing at it. And more than that, because in a world where everyone else lied to survive, only the fool could tell the truth and call it comedy. That was his gift. And his curse. So he walked the line, daily, hourly, between brilliance and offense, between freedom and punishment, between the king's laughter and the executioner's silence. As the torches burned lower and the echo of goblets and footsteps faded into stone, the medieval court began to shed its masks. The nobles retired to their chambers, full of wine and politics. Guards began their night rounds. Servants shuffled through the halls, clearing trenchers, sweeping ash, muttering quietly in the half-dark. And somewhere in the margins of this slowly settling world, the jester, who had spent the day watching, mocking, performing, was left with himself. For a man so public in his role, nightfall was his most private time. And while no hour in a castle was ever truly silent, this was the jester's best chance to stop pretending. Because even the fool, perhaps especially the fool, had to take off the motley eventually. Exiting the stage. The end of a jester's workday didn't come with applause or bows. There was no curtain to fall, no signal that the performance was over. Sometimes he would leave the great hall last, after one final laugh. Sometimes he would slip away quietly, unnoticed as the court turned to more serious matters. There were days when he would perform until he couldn't stand. Exhausted from dancing, juggling, singing, dodging insult, and redirecting tension. Other days, he might not be asked to perform at all, and would simply observe the court from the edges, contributing only a remark here or there. But even then, he was always working because the fool was never truly off duty. A single quip delivered as a chambermaid passed by, or a private comment muttered outside a noble's room, could have just as much weight as anything performed in the great hall. Still, there was a point when the court no longer needed him, or when it simply forgot him. That was when the night truly began, returning to his quarters. Depending on the status and generosity of his patron, the jester might have a small room to himself or share a corner of the castle with other servants. Royal jesters in high favor sometimes received their own chambers, modest but private. A room with a bed of straw or hay, a few personal items, maybe a blanket gifted by a noble, or a crude lock on the door. This space was not luxurious. It didn't need to be. It was a sanctuary, a place where he could remove the cap and bells, change from colorful rags into a simple tunic, and sit in silence. And that silence, after hours of noise and scrutiny, was its own kind of wealth. Here he might keep a few possessions. A broken instrument he hadn't yet fixed. A bit of bread or hard cheese saved from the kitchen. A pouch of coins given after a successful jest. Sheets of parchment, scraps of rhyme. A puppet or carved bauble with a worn face. In some cases, if the jester had family, a wife nearby, a child tucked away in the village or among the staff, this would be the only time he could see them. A stolen hour, away from laughter. A chance to speak plainly, or say nothing at all. But more often he was alone. Reflection and preparation. Many jesters used this time to rehearse. Quietly to themselves in darkness or candlelight. They'd whisper new verses, try out lines, adjust punchlines. They would replay the day's events. Who laughed too hard, who didn't laugh at all, who grew tense at what was meant to amuse. The fool had to be as much historian as comedian, cataloging court behavior, testing material, building armor from words. He might write in rhyme but think in code. The hawk limped today. Perhaps the falconer has grown careless. Translation. A noble is weakening. His influence is slipping. The bishop's eyes wandered too far during grace. Translation. A scandal brews. Every interaction was a thread. At night, the jester wove them together. Not to record, but to remember. He had no clerk. He had only his memory. And by morning, he'd need it sharpened. Coping with the day's weight. There is a quiet kind of trauma in being everyone's amusement. In knowing your words could bring a room to laughter or bring your death. The jester carried it all, and he rarely had a place to unload it. So many turned to wine, others to solitude. A few found comfort in animals, feeding scraps to stray dogs, talking softly to the castle horses, petting the cats that prowled the kitchens. Some jesters coped through ritual, lighting a candle for a dead parent, kissing a carved trinket, whispering a prayer not to be heard. Because while the court played at religion, the jester had to walk a line between sacred and profane. His jokes might offend the church. His songs might mock sermons. But in private, many jesters prayed. Not for salvation. For clarity. For the wisdom to know which jokes would save him and which ones might not. Unseen in the shadows. There were nights when the jester moved through the castle unseen. Listening. Watching. Not spying, not exactly, just observing. He might linger near the quarters of a noble known for his ambition or listen at the kitchen door to hear what the stewards were complaining about. These moments were not for performance. They were for survival. The jester's greatest power was knowledge. And while most of it came from what was said in public, the rest came in whispers. In footsteps. In silences that carried weight. He might not speak of what he heard, but it would surface later in a jest. A song. A look. A name dropped with a grin. Sleep if it came. Eventually, the fool would lie down. On straw, on wood, maybe a thin mattress if his patron was generous. The castle stones still held the day's chill. The wind howled through cracks in the mortar. The sounds of rats or creaking wood or far-off murmurs filled the room. And the jester closed his eyes. If sleep came, it was often light. The jester's dreams were rarely peaceful. They were filled with faces. Applause. Silence. Blood. Laughter. Falling. Because when your whole life is a performance, rest is hard to find. What night really meant. To everyone else, night was a pause, a time to recover, to forget, to escape. But to the jester, night was a mirror. A time to reflect on what he had said and what he couldn't say. It was the only moment he wasn't expected to smile. And even then, he sometimes smiled anyway out of habit or defiance. Because for the jester, tomorrow always came. Another day. Another performance. Another chance to amuse or insult or protect. Another tightrope walk between honesty and offense. And so he slept, if only for a few hours. One eye on the door. One ear tuned to the world that would wake before the sun. Because fools don't get to rest. They only get to prepare. Of all the institutions that shaped medieval life, monarchy, nobility, warfare, peasantry, none held such deep and pervasive influence as the church. It defined morality. It dictated behavior. It offered salvation and threatened damnation. And in that vast, holy architecture of belief and ritual, the jester stood out like a painted stain on a cathedral wall. He danced while others knelt. He joked when others wept. He mocked sin and sainthood alike, and somehow he survived. But that survival came at a cost. The relationship between the fool and the church was always uneasy, always shifting, always on the edge of conflict. Because if kings feared embarrassment, priests feared laughter. And the jester, armed with irreverence, wielded the most dangerous weapon of all, a joke that exposed a truth no sermon could hide. The church's view of the jester. From the church's perspective, the jester was a walking contradiction. On one hand, he served a purpose. In festivals like Feast of Fools, Carnival, and Twelfth Night, licensed irreverence had its place. During these rituals, roles were reversed, bishops might be mocked, altars parroted, sacred rites performed in grotesque mimicry. These events were not only tolerated but, for a time, endorsed by parts of the church. They served as pressure valves for social tension. But outside those rare moments, the jester posed a theological threat. He ridiculed authority, and the church was all authority. He mocked sin, which the church depended on for repentance. He turned sacred stories into punchlines and sacred figures into clowns. And worst of all, he was often right. The church feared the jester not because he corrupted minds, but because he revealed inconsistencies. Hypocrisy, vanity among the clergy, greed among bishops, indulgence by those who preached abstinence. He didn't accuse. He imitated. And that was far more dangerous. Mocking the clergy. Jesters didn't need to quote scripture to tear down a priest. They just needed to observe, then exaggerate. A bishop with fine robes and jeweled rings became the peacock of piety. A monk with a secret mistress became Father, forgive me for I keep forgetting. A priest who taxed peasants harshly was cast as Saint Koibox the Cruel. These performances were often hilarious and uncomfortable. Everyone in court knew which clergyman was being mocked, but no one said it aloud. The jester might act out a sermon that sounded more like a market auction, or tell a parable about a holy man who blessed his boots more than his congregation. The laughter was knowing. The jester wasn't inventing scandal. He was broadcasting it. Sometimes these jokes were met with silence. Sometimes with applause, and sometimes, if the wrong churchman was present, with backlash. Blasphemy or truth? There's a thin line between satire and sacrilege, and jesters walked it constantly. Most were smart enough to avoid direct mockery of Christ or the Virgin Mary. That was a line too far. But saints, relics, rituals, and clergy? Fair game, especially if the king enjoyed it. Still, some crossed boundaries. Some jesters were accused of blasphemy, a serious charge that could lead to flogging, imprisonment, excommunication, or worse. Especially during periods of heightened religious tension, when reformers and inquisitors rose in power, the jester's usual immunity evaporated. Yet for all the risk, some fools refused to hold back. They saw the church as another structure that deserved to be mocked, not out of atheism, which was rare and dangerous, but out of disgust with hypocrisy. A fat bishop calling for fasts. A cruel priest preaching mercy. A monk counting gold while swearing poverty. For these jesters, the church wasn't the enemy, its corruption was. And laughter was their only weapon. When the church fought back, not all clergy took the insults quietly. Some demanded punishment. They lobbied kings to silence their fools, calling jesters agents of the devil, corrupters of morals, destroyers of order. The term fool itself became associated with sinful rebellion, a person without the fear of God. In sermons, preachers would reference Proverbs. The mouth of fools poureth out foolishness. A fool uttereth all his mind, but a wise man keepeth it until afterwards. These weren't just scripture, they were warnings aimed squarely at the court's favorite entertainment. In some cases, church authorities tried to ban jesters from performing during holy times. Some tried to have court fools removed altogether. But unless the monarch agreed, they had little power to enforce these edicts. And many kings, amused by their fool's insight, refused to yield. Still, the jester always had to read the room. One joke too many against a high-ranking cleric could tip the balance and put the fool in chains. The fools who were believers. But not all jesters hated the church. Some believed deeply. Some prayed daily, even if they mocked the ritual. Some viewed their job not as rebellion, but as correction, a way to expose what the church needed to fix. There were fools who wept during Mass, who carried small crosses in their pockets, who confessed their sins sincerely even while poking fun at their confessors. For them, humor and faith were not enemies. They were companions. One jester might joke, "I pray every night, but I never ask for anything. I already got more than I can use." Or, "The Lord must love fools. He made so many of them bishops." Beneath the humor was often humility, the awareness that the jester, too, was flawed. That mocking power didn't make him righteous. It just made him necessary. A sacred role, after all? Some theologians, over time, came to recognize a strange truth. The jester served a spiritual function even if unintentionally. He reminded the court that pride is deadly. He challenged the arrogance of men in robes. He protected the people by making power look ridiculous. Was that not, in its own way, a kind of ministry? In a world where sermons were in Latin and doctrine was distant, the fool's performance reached everyone. His satire was often the only critique of the church most people ever heard. And because it came in the form of laughter, it was harder to silence. In this way, the jester sometimes became the only person in the castle brave enough to say what others only whispered and the only one who could do it without being burned. A final irony. In death, some jesters were buried without rites, declared unfit for sacred ground. Others were granted full ceremonies, their coffins carried with music and weeping. It all depended on their final reputation and which side of the church they had ended on. But the greatest irony is this: while bishops built cathedrals and scribes copied holy texts, it was the fool who often left behind truth wrapped in laughter. His sermons were jokes. His scriptures were rhymes. His altar was the court, his confession the crowd, his gospel absurdity. And sometimes that was the only honest thing in the room. The jester, by design, was a figure of motion. He danced, tumbled, shouted, juggled, and provoked. His humor was sharp, his wit quicker than a blade, and his energy tireless. But no one outruns time. And for the man in motley, aging wasn't just inevitable, it was existential. Because the court didn't just want jokes. It wanted youth, agility, and above all, freshness. So what happened when the jester began to slow? When his knees ached and his voice cracked? When the rhymes he once summoned in a flash began arriving with effort? The answer, as always in his world, depended on who still found him useful, and who was ready to replace him. The first signs of decline. For a jester, aging didn't begin with gray hair or wrinkled skin. It began with repetition. The jokes no longer shocked. The songs no longer thrilled. The same stories were told too often. The crowd, once eager, began to murmur, "Didn't he say that last feast? He used to be quicker. He's slipping." And worst of all, the laughter started to feel polite. Jesters were hypersensitive to their audience. They could smell insincerity. So when the nobles laughed too loudly at a mediocre joke, the fool knew what it meant. They were remembering who he used to be, not who he was now. Some tried to adapt. They shifted from tumbling to storytelling, from wild antics to sharp satire. They leaned harder on experience, becoming more subtle, more clever. A few succeeded, evolving into veteran jesters, more sage than clown, respected, even feared for their insight. But others couldn't keep up. Their bodies betrayed them, their minds dulled, and slowly they found themselves performing less and less, being replaced. In time, a younger fool would appear, perhaps a traveling performer brought in for a feast, perhaps a servant with a quick tongue who made the court laugh once, and was then handed a lute and a jester's cap. The older jester would be asked to train the new one, then to support him, then to step aside for a moment, and then he was gone, not fired, not dismissed, just faded. Sometimes the king allowed him to stay at court, no longer as a performer, but as a sort of fixture, a relic from a more entertaining time. He would be fed, given a place to sleep, nodded at in the halls. He might even be referred to with affection. "Old Fen, the king's fool when I was a child." But he no longer had a stage. Other times, the aging jester was cast out quietly, with a few coins and no ceremony. The court didn't owe him anything. There was no pension, no title, no estate. His value had always been tied to his performance, and once that was gone, so was the protection. What came after court? So where did they go? Some returned to the villages they came from, if they had anywhere left to return to. There, they might live in relative obscurity, a man known for wild stories and strange clothes. Some tried to join traveling troops, wandering from town to town as part of puppet shows or rustic pageants. But even among commoners, the aged jester wasn't always welcome. His humor had been forged for kings. His body couldn't keep up with the rough road. A few were taken in by monasteries, especially those who had avoided blasphemy in their careers. Some monks, especially in the later Middle Ages, came to view jesters as flawed but worthy souls. They were offered food, warmth, and perhaps the humbling work of copying texts or tending gardens. But this was rare, and usually involved a surrender of their old identity. And others, many others, died poor, alone, forgotten. The courts moved on, and the man who once made the king fall off his chair laughing now begged outside a gate, whispering a rhyme for a crust of bread. Kings who remembered, but not all endings were bitter. There were rulers who honored their jesters long after the bells stopped ringing. Henry VIII kept Will Sommers at court well into old age, even as Sommers became more of a quiet presence than an entertainer. He was allowed to dine in the royal household, and his name appeared in royal records long after his active years. Charles V of Spain granted pensions to jesters who had served loyally. Some courts in Italy and France maintained a tradition of keeping their fools as retired advisors, relics of an earlier age of wit, occasionally brought out to offer commentary or wisdom. In such cases, the jester became something rare, a witness to history valued not for performance, but for perspective. He had seen monarchs rise and fall, wars begin and end, children grow into tyrants or saints. He had, in his own strange way, become a living memory of the court. And for kings who feared the silence of their own conscience, that memory was valuable. The jester's final reflection. For the fool himself, aging was not just a loss of energy, it was a reckoning. A life spent performing, deceiving, provoking, to what end? Some felt pride. They had influenced kings, saved lives with a well-placed joke, exposed corruption, made thousands laugh. Their legacy was not carved in stone, but echoed in memory. Others felt regret. The years blurred. The faces blurred. Who had they really been underneath the paint? And some, perhaps, died as they lived, laughing at the absurdity of it all. A man who told the truth in a lie, who served the powerful by mocking them, who was never supposed to matter, and yet somehow he did. Burial and remembrance. Most jesters were buried without fanfare among the servants outside consecrated ground. No monuments. No epitaphs. Perhaps a crude carving, "Here lies the fool." But in some courts, especially those with longer traditions of court fools, a jester might be buried with honors. A cross. A poem. A story told one last time over his grave. Because even if the world forgot him, the laughter he sparked remained, passed from voice to voice, a song half-remembered, a tale about a king and his fool that still made children grin. And in that, perhaps, was the closest thing to immortality a jester could hope for. When the castles crumbled and the crowns changed hands, when the wars ended and the names of kings faded from common memory, the jester endured. He was no longer the painted man dancing for his supper in stone halls, but his spirit, his method survived. It lived on in satire, in performance, in protest, in the power of laughter to both reveal and protect. The medieval jester was not merely a figure of fun. He was a cultural prototype, the first to weaponize humor in the service of truth. His legacy didn't vanish when the courts modernized or when royal households moved toward diplomacy and bureaucracy. Instead, it evolved. It echoed across centuries, transforming into theater, literature, political commentary, even journalism. The jester was gone, but he left fingerprints on the world that can still be seen in every corner where laughter is used to challenge power. From court to stage, the birth of the comedic archetype. The fool gave rise to characters that transcended eras. From Shakespeare to street theater, his chaotic wisdom and emotional range became fundamental to Western storytelling. Shakespeare's fools, Touchstone, Fest, Lear's fool, were not mere comic relief. They were often the only characters who could speak the truth. The echoes of real-life jesters are unmistakable. They observe, comment, provoke, and reveal. They make us laugh while tearing open emotional wounds. They are both comic and tragic, sacred and profane. In King Lear, the fool is Lear's only remaining voice of reason, pushing back with riddles and irony against the king's descent into madness. He is not just a side character. He's the conscience of the play. This theatrical lineage didn't stop with Shakespeare. The commedia dell'arte tradition in Renaissance Italy gave us Arlecchino and Pulcinella, characters who, like jesters, existed to invert the world, mock authority, and celebrate cleverness over power. Even today, modern clowns, comedians, and court satirists draw from these roots, whether they know it or not. The very idea of a professional truth-teller who uses humor to do what others dare not, that is the jester's gift. Political satire, the fool as public conscience. In post-medieval Europe, as absolute monarchy gave way to constitutional systems and republics, the jester's role didn't disappear, it shifted into satire. In the 17th and 18th centuries, satirical pamphlets and cartoons became the new motley. Writers like Jonathan Swift, Voltaire, and Alexander Pope used humor and irony in precisely the same way jesters once did, to ridicule power, expose hypocrisy, and speak dangerous truths under the shield of comedy. Voltaire's mockery of religious fanaticism, Swift's savage satire in A Modest Proposal, and countless anonymous broadsides all shared a single genetic code, the fool's license to offend in service of awakening. By the 19th century, newspapers featured editorial cartoons which took the jester's tradition of visual mockery and modernized it with ink and print. Monarchs and ministers were no longer lampooned in rhyme by a man in bells, they were skewered with pen and ink with images that circled entire empires. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the jester's legacy became more visible than ever through stand-up comedy, political talk shows, and satire on television. Shows like The Daily Show, Last Week Tonight, and Saturday Night Live continue the tradition of using humor as a tool for civic resistance. These modern jesters stand on stages instead of in courts. But the mission is the same: mock the powerful, comfort the powerless, and speak truth in the only language that everyone listens to: laughter. Fools in literature and myth, enduring archetypes. The jester archetype found fertile ground in literature and folklore beyond Europe as well. In Russian tales, the skamorok played a similar role, a wandering performer and truth-teller, sometimes viewed as a threat by both church and state. In Japanese tradition, characters like kaijin performers used farce and satire between no dramas to give the audience relief and sometimes to criticize social norms under the cover of absurdity. Globally, the fool emerged not as an accident but as a cultural necessity. Every society needed someone who could speak sideways, someone who could entertain while saying what no one else dared to say aloud. Even the sacred texts weren't immune. In the Bible, the fool is both a warning and a paradox. Often despised, but sometimes the vessel of hidden wisdom. In Buddhist stories, the holy fool is the one who laughs at illusion. In Sufi mysticism, the madman sometimes sees more clearly than the scholar. These motifs remind us that the jester didn't belong to just one time or place. He was universal, symbol of rebellion and subversion. In modern movements, especially those that confront authoritarianism, the jester has returned not just as metaphor but as tactic. Protesters and dictatorships have dressed as clowns or fools to disarm police, confuse media, and expose state brutality through parody. The image of the clown confronting riot shields has become iconic. Absurdity in the face of oppression. It's the medieval fool, reborn as a modern rebel. Even in cyberspace, the jester lives on. Memes, satire accounts, anonymous whistleblowers using humor. These are the new tools of mockery. Laughter travels faster than truth. And when both are combined, regimes tremble. A cultural warning bell. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the jester is not the joke itself, but the function of the joke. The jester warns, not with weapons, not with orders, but with absurdity so sharp it cuts through pride. Wherever the fool is present, he becomes a signal. When he disappears, beware. Power has grown intolerant. When he is punished, beware. Truth has been silenced. When he is welcomed, listen. The laughter has meaning. Laughter is not always rebellion, but it is never meaningless. And the jester, more than any warrior or priest, understood this. Immortality in spirit. The motley faded. The bells were silenced. No one today walks into a royal court to speak truth in riddles while juggling flaming pins. But the jester didn't die. He split into fragments: comedians, cartoonists, playwrights, talk show hosts, satirists, jesters of the stage and screen. He became a genre, a method, a tradition. Every time a performer holds a mirror to the powerful and dares to distort it until the truth appears, the jester speaks again. Not in Latin, not in rhyme, but in the language of his time. And somewhere under the din of history, he's still laughing. Dawn breaks not with birdsong, but with the wet snort of a half-frozen ox outside the castle walls. The fog hangs low, curling around the stone like a shawl draped over the shoulders of a weary giant. Somewhere within the damp belly of the castle, a man stirs, not a noble, not a knight, not a priest. He sleeps in a room too small to matter and wakes without anyone to dress him. The jester begins his day alone. He stretches slowly, joints crackling like dry parchment, and wipes the sleep from his eyes with a sleeve patched in 5 colors. There is no servant to bring him bread, no maid to heat his wash water. He is not important enough for that. He is expected to be ready, awake, and amusing before the rest of the court has even rolled over in their feathered beds. He pulls on the motley. Red, blue, yellow colors loud enough to be seen from the far side of the hall but worn thin from years of use. The bells on his cap are mostly broken now. They don't ring so much as they rattle. He likes it better that way. The quieter he can move, the more he can hear. As he slips into the corridor, the first servants are already lighting torches and hauling buckets. He nods to a boy with a twisted foot who tends the hearth, shares a half-smile with the baker's daughter, and mutters a rhymed insult to the steward's back as he passes. He's not expected to be kind. He's expected to be clever. The hall is still empty when he arrives, cavernous and cold, the tapestries twitching with drafts. But soon the day will begin, and so will the act. By midday, the jester has told jokes to 3 barons, 1 bishop, and a visiting envoy from a kingdom he cannot pronounce. He's been slapped on the back by a drunk noble, nearly tripped by a sullen page, and narrowly avoided saying something treasonous when the queen asked him if her new gown made her look unusually firm. He plays the lute badly. He sings off-key on purpose. He juggles apples, then eats one midair. He turns a biting insult into a prayer, a sermon into a song into a story, and before the laughter even fades, he's already watching the next face, reading the next mood. Because this is what no one tells you, being a fool is not just performance. It is navigation. It is knowing when a laugh is safe. It is knowing which noble must never be made the punchline. It is watching the king's eyes for the difference between amusement and fury. It is survival by syllable. At the feast, he performs again. More wine now. More danger. People emboldened by drink laugh harder and betray more. Secrets slip through grins. The jester catches them, stores them, reshapes them into rhymes. He tells a joke that makes a duke choke and a squire spill wine across a silk lap. He takes a bow and the applause comes like thunder in a dream, distant, disconnected, unreal. But behind the laughter, he sees the steward frown. He sees the bishop whisper. He sees the new fool in waiting, young, fast-tongued, burning with the hunger to replace him, lurking just close enough to matter. When the feast ends, he wanders the empty halls. His motley is stained with grease and gravy. His voice is hoarse. His feet are blistered. But he stops to comfort a crying servant, her hand bleeding from a scullery accident. He wraps it in a strip from his own sleeve and makes her smile with a whispered limerick. He does not do this for favor. There is none to gain. He does it because he remembers. Before the laughter, before the court, before the paint, he was a boy with bruises, watching his mother beg bread from a priest who called her unclean. That memory has never left him. And neither has the reason he became a jester, not to be adored, but to be heard. Later, in the dark, he sits alone in his cell-like room. He hums an old tune under his breath, one no one else knows anymore. His fingers trace the cracks in the wooden table. He writes a new verse in the dust. He remembers how the king laughed today. A deep, genuine laugh. One that echoed. One that bought him another day. He exhales, slow, folds his hands. And he prays. Not for glory. Not for rest. Just for the wisdom to know where tomorrow's line is and how not to cross it. Because tomorrow, the motley goes on. Tomorrow, the court will forget again that he is not simply a toy. Tomorrow, he will perform. Again. As he always has. Until the day he can't. And on that day, when the laughter fades, when the bells are silent, when the jest ends, he hopes only this. That someone, somewhere, remembers the fool who dared to tell the truth. If you've made it this far through the twisted, fascinating, absurd, and deeply human life of the medieval jester, thank you. These figures weren't just court decorations. They were voices in the dark. Comedians, critics, historians, survivors. They walked the tightrope of power and wit with no net below them. And their legacy lives on. So if this story made you think, made you feel, or made you laugh just once, consider subscribing. There are many more stories like this waiting to be told. And hey, even the fool would ask. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history.